This is a LibriVox recording, and all LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, more LibriVox recordings, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording read for you by Perry Clayton. Cats by Robert Lind. The champion cat show has been held at the Crystal Palace, but the champion cat was not there. One could not possibly allow him to appear in public. He is for show, but not in a cage. He does not compete because he is above competition. You know this as well as I. Probably you possess him. I certainly do. This is the supreme test of a cat's excellence, the test of possession. One does not say, you should see Brailsford's cat, or you should see Addock's cat, or you should see Sharp's cat, but you should see our cat. There is nothing we are more egoistic about, not even children, than about cats. I have heard a man, for lack of anything better to boast about, boasting that his cat eats cheese. In anyone else's cat it would have seemed an inferior habit, and only worth mentioning to the servant as a warning. But because the cat happens to be his cat, this man talks about its vice excitedly among women as though it were an accomplishment. It is seldom that we hear a cat publicly reproached with guilt by anyone above a cook. He is not permitted to steal from our own larder, but if he visits the next door house by stealth and returns over the wall with a Dover sole in his jaws, we really cannot help laughing. We are a little nervous at first, and our mirth is tinged with pity at the thought of the probably elderly and dyspeptic gentleman who had his luncheon filched away almost from under his nose. If we were quite sure that it was from number 14 and not from number 9 or number 11 that the fish had been stolen, we might conceivably call around to offer to pay for it, but with a cat one is never quite sure, and we cannot call around on all the neighbors and make a general announcement that our cat is a thief. In any case, the next move lies with the wronged neighbor. As day follows day, and there is no sign of his irate and murder-bent figure advancing up the path, we recover our mental balance and begin to see the cat's exploit in a new light. We do not yet extol it on moral grounds, but undoubtedly the more we think of it, the deeper becomes our admiration. Of the two great heroes of the Greeks, we admire one for his valor and the other for his cunning. The epic of the cat is the epic of Odysseus. The old gentleman with the Dover sole gradually assumes the aspect of a Polyphemus outwitted and humiliated to the point of not even being able to throw things at his tormentor. Clever cat. Nobody else's cat could have done such a thing. We should like to celebrate the rape of the Dover sole in Latin verse. As for the Achillean sort of prowess, we do not demand it of a cat, but we are proud of it when it exists. There is a pleasure in seeing strange cats fly at his approach, either in single file over the wall, or in the scattered aimlessness of a bursting bomb. Theoretically, we hate him to fight, but if he does fight and comes home with a torn ear, we have to summon up all the resources of our finer nature in order not to rejoice on noticing that the cat next door looks as though it has been through a railway accident. I am sorry for the cat next door. I hate him so, and it must be horrible to be hated. But he should not sit on my wall and look at me with yellow eyes. If his eyes were any other color, even the blue that is now said to be the mark of the runaway husband, I feel certain I could just manage to endure him. But they are the sort of yellow eyes that you expect to see looking at you from a hole in the paneling in a novel by Mr. Sax Rohmer. The only reason why I'm not frightened of them is that the cat is so obviously frightened of me. I never did him any injury unless to hate is to injure, but he lowers his head when I appear, as though he expected to be guillotined. He does not run away, he merely crouches like a guilty thing. Perhaps he remembers how often he has stepped delicately over my seed beds, but not so delicately as to leave no mark of ruin among the infant lettuces and the less than infant autumn sprouting broccoli. These things I could forgive him, but it is not easy to forgive him the look in his eyes when he watches a bird at its song. They are ablaze with evil. He becomes a sort of Jack the Ripper at the opera. People tell us that we should not blame cats for this sort of thing. that it is in their nature, and so forth. They even suggest that a cat is no more cruel in eating a robin than we are cruel ourselves in eating chicken. This seems to me to be quibbling. In the first place, there is an immense difference between a robin and a chicken. In the second place, we are willing to share our chicken with the cat. At least we are willing to share the skin and such of the bones as are not required for soup. Besides, a cat has not the same need of delicacies as a human being. It can eat, and even digest, anything. It can eat the black skin of a filleted plaice. It can eat the bits of gristle that people leave on the side of their plates. It can eat boiled cod. It can even eat New Zealand mutton. There is no reason why an animal with so undiscriminating a palate should demand songbirds for its food, when even human beings, who are fairly unscrupulous eaters, have agreed in some measure to abstain from them. On reflection, however, I doubt if it is his appetite for birds that makes the cat with the yellow eyes feel guilty. If you were able to talk to him in his own language, and formulate your accusations against him as a bird eater, he would probably be merely puzzled and look on you as a crank. If you pursued the argument and compelled him to moralize his position, he would, I fancy, explain that the birds were very wicked creatures, and that their cruelties to the worms and the insects were more than the flesh and blood could stand. He would work himself up into a generous idealization of himself as the guardian of law and order amid the bloody strife of the cabbage patch, the preserver of the balance of nature. If cats were as clever as we, they would compile an atrocities blue book about worms. Alas, poor thrush, with how bedraggled a reputation you would come through such an exposure. With how hunnish a tread you would be depicted treading the lawn, sparing neither age nor sex, seizing the infant worm as it puts out its head to take its first bewildered peep at the rolling sun. Cats could write sonnets on such a theme. Then there is the other beautiful potential poem, The Cry of the Snail. How tender-hearted cats are! Their sympathy seems to be all but universal, always on the lookout for an object, ready to extend itself anywhere where it is needed, except, as is but human, to their victims. Yellow eyes or not, I begin to be persuaded that the cat next door is a noble fellow. It may well be that his look as I pass is a look not of fear, but of repulsion. He has seen me going out among the worms with a sharp, no, not a very sharp, spade, and regards me as no better than an ogre. If I could only explain to him, but I shall never be able to do so. He could no more appreciate my point of view about worms than I can appreciate his about robins. Luckily, we both eat chicken. This may ultimately help us to understand one another. On the other hand, part of the fascination of cats may be due to the fact that it is so difficult to come to an understanding with them. A man talks to a horse or a dog as to an equal. To a cat he has to be deferential, as though it had some sphinx-like quality that baffled him. He cannot order a cat about with the certainty of being obeyed. He cannot be sure that, if he speaks to it, it will even raise its eyes. If it is perfectly comfortable, it will not. A cat is obedient only when it is hungry, or when it takes the fancy. It may be a parasite, but it is never a servant. The dog does your bidding, but you do the cat's. At the same time, the contrast between the cat and the dog has often been exaggerated by dog lovers. They tell you stories of dogs that remained with their dead masters, as though there were no fidelity in cats. It was only the other day, however, that the newspapers gave an account of a cat that remained with the body of its murdered mistress in the most faithful tradition of the dogs. I know again of cats who will go out for a walk with a human fellow creature as dogs do. I have frequently seen a lady walking across Hampstead Heath with a cat in train. When you go for a walk with a dog, however, the dog protects you. When you go for a walk with the cat, you feel that you are protecting the cat. It is strange that the cat should have imposed the myth of its helplessness upon us. It is an animal with an almost boundless capacity for self-help. It can jump up walls, it can climb trees, it can run, as the proverb says, like greased lightning. It is armed like an African chief. Yet it has contrived to make itself a pampered pet, so that we are alarmed if it attempts to follow us out of the gate into a world of dogs, and only feel happy when it is purring, rolling on its back and purring as we rub its Adam's apple by the fireside. There is nothing that gives a greater sense of comfort than the purring of a cat. It is the most flattering music in nature. One feels, as one listens, like a humble lover in a bad novel who says, "You do then like me a little bit, after all?" The fact that a cat is not utterly miserable in our presence always comes with the freshness and delight of a surprise. The happiness of a crowing baby, newly introduced to us, may be still more flattering, but a cat will get round people who cannot tolerate babies. It is all the more to be wondered at that a cat, which is such a master of this conversational sort of music, should ever attempt any other. There never was an animal less fit to be a singer. Someone, was it Cowper, has said that there are no really ugly voices in nature, and that he could imagine that there was something to be said even for the donkey's bray. I should have thought that the beautiful voices in nature were few, and that most of them could be defended only on the ground of some pleasant association. Humanity, at least, has been unanimous in its condemnation of the cat as part of nature's chorus. Poems have been written in praise of the corncrake as a singer, but never of the cat. All the associations we have with cats have not accustomed us to that discordant howl. It converts love itself into a torment such as can be found only in the pages of a 20th century novel. In it we hear the jungle decadent, the beast of dissolution, but not yet civilized. When it rises at night outside the window, we always explain to visitors, "No, that's not Peter. That's the cat next door with the yellow eyes." The man who will not defend the honor of his cat cannot be trusted to defend anything. The end of Cats by Robert Lind. This recording read for you by Perry Clayton.
The Celebration of Intellect by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Philip Weichselbaum. I cannot consent to wander from the duties of this day into the fracas of politics. The brute noise of cannon has, I know, a most poetic echo in these days, when it is an instrument of freedom and the primal sentiments of humanity. Yet it is but representative and a far-off means and servant. But here in the college we are in the presence of the constituency and the principle itself. Here is, or should be, the majesty of reason and the creative cause, and it were a compounding of all gradation and reverence to suffer the clash of swords and the boyish strife of passion and the feebleness of military strength to intrude on this sanctity and omnipotence of intellectual law. Against the heroism of soldiers I set the heroism of scholars, which consists in ignoring the other. You shall not put up in your academy the statue of Caesar or Pompey, of Nelson or Wellington, of Washington or Napoleon, of Garibaldi, but of Archimedes, of Milton, of Newton. Archimedes disdained to apply himself to the useful arts, only to the liberal or the causal arts. Hero the king reproached him with his barren studies. Like Thales, he was willing to show him that he was quite able in rude matters, if he could condescend to them, and he conducted the defense of Syracuse against the Romans. Then he returned to his geometry, and when the Roman soldier and the sack of Syracuse broke into his study, the philosopher could not rise from his chair and his diagram, and took his death without resistance. Michelangelo gave himself to art, despising all meaner pursuits. When the war came to his own city, he lent his genius and defended Florence as long as he was obeyed. Milton congratulates the Parliament that, whilst London is besieged and blocked, the Thames infested, inroads and excursions round, and battle oft rumour to be marching up to her walls and suburb trenches. Yet then are the people, or the greater part, more than at other times, wholly taken up with the study of highest and most important matters to be performed, they reasoning, reading, inventing, discoursing, even to a rarity and admiration, things not before discoursed or written, and the fact argues a just confidence in the grandeur and self-subsistency of the cause of religious liberty, which made all material war an impertinence. For either science and literature is a hypocrisy, or it is not. If it be, then resign your charter to the legislature, turn your college into barracks and warehouses, and divert the funds of your founders into the stock of a rope walk, or a candle factory, a tan yard, or some other undoubted conveniency for the surrounding population. But if the intellectual interest be, as I hold, no hypocrisy, but the only reality, then it behooves us to enthrone it, obey it, and give it possession of us and ours, to give, among other possessions, the college into its hand, casting down every idol, every pretender, every hoary, every dignified blunder that has crept into its administration. At this season, the colleges keep their anniversaries, and in this country, where education is a primary interest, every family has a representative in their halls. A son, a brother, or one of our own kindred is there for his training. But even if we had no son or friend therein, yet the college is part of the community, and it is there for us, is training our teachers, civilizers, and inspirers. It is essentially the most radiating and public of agencies, like, but better than, the lighthouse, or the alarm bell, or the sentinel who fires a signal cannon, or the telegraph which speeds the local news over the land. Besides, it deals with a force which it cannot monopolize or confine, cannot give to those who come to it and refuse to those outside. I have no doubt of the force, and for me the only question is whether the force is inside. This power which it deals is dear to all. If the colleges were better, if they had any monopoly of it, nay, if they really had it, had the power of imparting valuable thought, creative principles, truths which become powers, thoughts which become talents, if they could cause a mind not profound should become profound, we should all rush to their gates. Instead of contriving inducements to draw students, you would need to set police at the gates to keep order in the inrushing multitude. These are giddy times, and, you say, the college will be deserted. No, never was it so much needed. But I say, those were the giddy times which went before these, and the new times are the times of arraignment, times of trial, and times of judgment. Just because the college was false to its trust, because the scholars did not learn and teach, because they were traitors and left their altars and libraries and worship of truth and played the sycophant to presidents and generals and members of Congress, and gave degrees and literary and social honors to those whom they ought to have rebuked and exposed, incurring the contempt of those whom they ought to have put in fear, then the college is suicidal, ceases to be a school. Power oozes out of it just as fast as truth does. And instead of overawing the strong and upholding the good, it is a hospital for decayed tutors. This integrity over all partial knowledge and skill, homage to truth, how rare! Few men wish to know how the thing really stands, what is the law of it without reference to persons. Other men are victims of their means. Sanity consists in not being subdued by your means. Two men cannot converse together on any topic without presently finding where each stands in moral judgment, and each learns whether the other's view commands or is commanded by his own. I presently know whether my companion has more candor or less, more hope for men or less, whether his sense of duty is more or less severe and his generosity larger than mine, whether he stands for ideal justice or for a timorous expediency. Society is always idolatrous and exaggerates the merits of those who work to vulgar ends. But genius may be known by its probity. Never was pure valor, and almost I might say never pure ability, shown in a bad cause. For ambition makes insane. Society is always taken by surprise at any new example of common sense and of simple justice as at a wonderful discovery. Thus, at Mr. Rary's mode of taming a horse by kindness, or Garibaldi's emancipation of Italy for Italy's sake, at the introduction of gentleness into insane asylums, and of cleanliness and comfort into penitentiaries. A farmer wished to buy an ox. The seller told him how well he had treated the animal. "But," said my farmer, "I asked the ox, and the ox showed me by marks that could not lie that he had been abused." We affect to slight England and Englishmen, but I note that we had a vast self-esteem on the subject of Bunker Hill, Yorktown, and New Orleans. We should not think it much to beat Indians or Mexicans, but to beat English. The English newspapers and some writers of reputation disparage America. Meantime, I note that the British people are emigrating hither by thousands, which is a very sincere and apt to be a very seriously considered expression of opinion. The emigration into America of British, as well as of continental people, is the eulogy of America by the most competent and sincere arbiters. The hater of property and of government takes care to have his warranty deed recorded, and the book written against fame and learning has the author's name on the title page. Gentlemen, I too am an American and value practical talent. I love results and hate abortions. I delight in people who can do things. I value talent, perhaps no man more. I value dearly the poet who knows his art so well that, when his voice vibrates, it fills the hearer with sympathetic song, just as a powerful note of an organ sets all tuned strings in its neighborhood in accordant vibration. The novelist with his romance, the architect with his palace, the composer with a score. I wish you to be eloquent, to grasp the bolt and to hurl it home to the mark. I wish to see that Mirabeau who knows how to seize the heartstrings of the people and drive their hands and feet in the way he wishes them to go, to fill them with himself, to enchain men so that their will and purpose is in abeyance, and they serve him with a million hands, just as implicitly as his own members obey him. But I value it more when it is legitimate, when the talent is in true order, subject to genius, subject to the total and native sentiment of the man, and therefore in harmony with the public sentiment of mankind. Such is the patriotism of Demosthenes, of Patrick Henry, and of what was best in Cicero and Burke. Not an ingenious special pleading, not the making a plausible case, but strong by the strength of the facts themselves. Then the orator is still one of the audience, persuaded by the same reasons which persuade them, not a ventriloquist, not a juggler, not a wire puller paid to manage the lobby and caucus. In Demosthenes is this realism of genius. He wins his cause honestly. His doctrine is self-reliance. If it please you to note it, my counsels to you are not such whereby I should grow great among you, and you become little among the Grecians. But they be of that nature as is sometimes not good for me to give, but are always good for you to follow. You, gentlemen, are selected out of the great multitude of your mates, out of those who began life with you, set apart through some strong persuasion of your own or of your friends, that you were capable of the high privilege of thought. Need enough there is of such a band of priests of intellect and knowledge, and great is the office, and well deserving and well paying the last sacrifices and the highest ability. But I wish this were a needless task, to urge upon you scholars the claims of thought and learning. The author of the world educates with care the senses and the understanding. Men are as they think. A certain quantity of power belongs to a certain quantity of truth. And the man who knows any truth not yet discerned by other men is master of all other men, so far as that truth and its wide relations are concerned. Do you suppose that the thunderbolt falls short? Do you imagine that a lie will nourish and work like a truth? The whole battle is fought in a few heads. A little finer order, a larger angle of vision, commands centuries of facts and millions of thoughtless people. It reserves all rank. He who discriminates is the father of his father. And yet the world is not saved. With this divine oracle, we somehow do not get instructed. Here are still perverse millions full of passion, crime, and blood. Here are bad governors and bad subjects. Nay, in the class called intellectual, the men are no better than the uninstructed. They use their wit and learning in the service of the devil. There are bad books and false teachers and corrupt judges, and in the institutions of education a want of faith in their own cause. Nay, it happens often that the well-bred and refined, the inhabitants of cities, dwelling amidst colleges, churches, and scientific museums, lectures, poets, libraries, newspapers, and other aids supposed intellectual, are more vicious and malignant than the rude country people, and need to have their corrupt voting and violence corrected by the cleaner and wiser suffrages of poor farmers. The poet does not believe in his poetry. Men are ashamed of their intellect. Instinct is the name for the potential wit, that feeling which each has that what is done by any man or agent is done by the same wit as his. He looks at all men as his representatives and is glad to see that his wit can work at that problem as it ought to be done and better than he could do it, whether it be to build, engineer, carve, paint, sing, heal, or compute, or play chess, or ride, or swim. We feel as if one man wrote all the books, painted, built, in dark ages, and we are sure we can do more than ever was done. It was the same mind that built the world. The understanding is the name we give to the low, limitary power working to short ends, to daily life in house and street. This is the power which the world of men adopt and educate. He is the calculator, he is the merchant, the politician, the worker and the useful. He works by shifts, by compromise, by statute, by bribes. All his activities are to short, personal ends, and he is apt to be a talker, a boaster, a busybody. Will you let me say to you what I think is the organic law of learning? It is to observe the order, to keep down the talent, to enthrone the instinct. There must be the perpetual rallying and self-recovery. Each talent links itself so fast with self-love and with petty advantage that it loses sight of its obedience, which is beautiful, and sets up for itself and makes confusion. Falsehood begins as soon as it disobeys. It works for show and for the shop, and the greater it grows, the more is the mischief and misleading, so that presently all is wrong. Talent is mistaken for genius, dogma or system for truth. Now the idea of a college is an assembly of such men, obedient each to this pure light, and drawing from it illumination to that science or art to which his constitution and affections draw him. And the very highest advantage which a young man of good mind can meet is to find such a teacher. No books, no aids, laboratory, apparatus, prizes can compare with this. Here is sympathy. Here is an order that corresponds to that in his own mind, and in all sound minds, and the hope and impulse imparted. And education is what it should be, a delightful unfolding of the faculties in right order. I could heartily wish it were otherwise. But there is a certain shyness of genius, of free thought, of a master of art in colleges, which is as old as the rejection of Molière by the French Academy, of Bentley by the pedants of his time, and only the other day of Arago. In Oxford, the recent rejection of Max Müller. If the truth must be told, thought is as rare in colleges as in cities. The necessity of a mechanical system is not to be denied. Young men must be classed and employed, not according to the secret needs of each mind, but by some available plan that will give weekly and annual results. And a little violence must be done to private genius to accomplish this. Then genius is always its own law, and must be a little impatient and rebellious to this rule, so that, of necessity, a certain hostility and jealousy of genius grows up in the masters of routine, and unless, by rare good fortune, the professor has a generous sympathy with genius, and takes care to interpose a certain relief and cherishing and reverence for the wild poet and dawning philosopher he has detected in his classes, that will happen which has happened so often, that the best scholar, he for whom colleges exist, finds himself a stranger and an orphan therein. 'Tis precisely analogous to what befalls in religious societies. In the Romans Spiridion, a few years ago, we had what it seems was a piece of accurate autobiography. The story of a young saint who comes into a convent for her education, and not falling into the system and the little parties in the convent, but inspired with an enthusiasm which finds nothing there to feed it. It turns out in a few days that every hand is against this young votary. Piety in a convent accuses everyone, from the novice to the abbess. What right have you to be better than your neighbor? Piety comes to be regarded as a spy and a rebel. And how often we have had repeated the trials of the young man who made no figure at college because his own methods were new and extraordinary, and who only prospered at last because he forsook theirs and took his own. It is true that the university and the church, which should be counterbalancing institutions to our great material institutions of trade and of territorial power, do not express the sentiment of the popular politics and the popular optimism, whatever it be. Harvard College has no voice in Harvard College, but State Street votes it down on every ballot. Everything will be permitted there which goes to adorn Boston Whiggism. Is it geology, astronomy, poetry, antiquities, art, rhetoric? But that which it exists for, to be a fountain of novelties out of heaven, a Delphus uttering warning and ravishing oracles to lift and lead mankind. That it shall not be permitted to do or to think of. On the contrary, every generosity of thought is suspect and gets a bad name. And all the youth come out decrepit citizens, not a prophet, not a poet, not a daemon, but is gagged and stifled or driven away. All that is sought in the instruction is drill, tutors, not inspirers. I conceive that a college should have no mean ambition, but should aim at a reverent discipline and invitation of the soul, that there, if nowhere else in the world, genius should find its home. Here imagination should be greeted with the problems in which it delights, the noblest tasks to the muse proposed, and the most cordial and honoring rewards. Here the highest duties be urged, and enthusiasm for liberty and wisdom should breed enthusiasm and form heroes for the state. The college should hold the profound thought, and the church the great heart, to which the nation should turn, and these two should be counterbalancing to the bad politics and selfish trade. But there is but one institution, and not three. The church and the college now take their tone from the city, and do not dictate their own. You all well know the downward tendency in literature, the facility with which men renounce their youthful aims and say, "The labor is too severe, the price too high for me," and they accept the employments of the market. Ah, gentlemen, it's only a dream of mine, and perhaps never will be true. But I thought a college was a place not to train talents, not to train attorneys and those who say what they please, but to adorn genius, which only speaks truth, and after the way which truth uses, namely beauty. A college was to teach you geometry, or the lovely laws of space and figure, chemistry, botany, zoology, the streaming of thought into form, and the precipitation of atoms, which nature is. This, then, is the theory of education, the happy meeting of the young soul, filled with a desire, with the living teacher, who has already made the passage from the center forth, step by step, along the intellectual roads to the theory and practice of special science. Now, if there be genius in the scholar, that is, a delicate sensibility to the laws of the world, and the power to express them again in some new form, he is made to find his own way. He will greet joyfully the wise teacher, but colleges and teachers are nowise essential to him. You will find teachers everywhere. I would have you rely on nature ever, wise, omnific, thousand-handed nature, equal to teach emergency, which can do very well without colleges, and if the Latin, Greek, algebra, or art were in the parents, it will be in the children without being pasted on. If your college and your literature are not felt, it is because the truth is not in them. When you say the times, the persons are prosaic, where is the feudal or the Saracenic or Egyptian architecture? Where the romantic manners? Where the Romish or the Calvinistic religion, which made a kind of poetry in the air for Milton or Byron or Belzoni? But to us it is barren. You expose your atheism. Is a railroad or a shoe factory or an insurance office, bank or bakery outside the system and connection of things, or further from God than a sheep pasture or a clam bank? Is chemistry suspended? Do not the electricities and the imponderable influences play with all their magic undulations? Do not gravity and polarity keep their unerring watch on a needle and thread, on a cobbler's lapstone or a switchman's turntable as on the moon's orbit? Only bring a deep observer, and he will make light of the new shop or old cathedral, all one to him, or new circumstances that afflict you. He will find the circumstances not altered, as deep a cloud of mystery on the cause, as dazzling a glory on the invincible law. Is it so important whether a man wears a shoe buckle or ties his shoe lappet with a string? Bring the inside, and he will find as many beauties and heroes and astounding strokes of genius close by him as Shakespeare or Aeschylus or Dante beheld. It was in a beggarly heath farm, it was in a mean country inn that Burns found his fancy so sprightly. You find the times and places mean. My friend, stretch a few threads over a common Aeolian harp, and put it in your window, and listen to what it says of times and the heart of nature. I do not think that you will believe that the miracle of nature is less, the chemical power worn out. Watch the breaking morning, the enchantments of the sunset. If I had young men to teach, I should say to them, keep the intellect sacred, revere it, give all to it. Its oracles countervail all. Attention is its acceptable prayer. Sit low and wait long, and know that next to being its minister, like Aristotle, and perhaps better than that, is the profound reception and sympathy, without ambition, which secularizes and trades it. Go sit with the hermit in you, who knows more than you do. You will find life enhanced and doors opened to grander entertainments. It all comes easily that he does as snow and vapor, heat, wind, and light. Power costs nothing to the powerful. I should say to them, do what you can do. He that draws on his own talent cannot be overshadowed or supplanted. Homage to truth discriminates good and evil. Power never departs from it. Our colleges may differ much in the scale of requirements, and the examination for admission and the examination for degrees and honors may be lax in this college and severe in that, and you may find facilities, translations, syllabuses and tutors here or there to coach you through, but 'tis very certain that an examination is yonder before us, and an examining committee that cannot be escaped or deceived, that every scholar is to be put fairly on his own powers, and must hear the questions proposed, and answer them by himself, and receive honor or dishonor according to the fidelity shown. For the men and women of your time, the circle of your friends and employers, your conditions, the invisible world, are the interrogators. When the great painter was told by a Duber, "I have painted 5 pictures, whilst you have made 1," he replied, "Pingo in eternitatem." Study for eternity smiled on me, says Van Helmont, and it were a good rule to read some lines at least every day that shall not be of the day's occasion or task, but of study for eternity. I have detained you too long, but it is the privilege of the moral sentiment to be every moment new and commanding, and old men cannot see the powers of society, the institutions, the laws under which they have lived, passing or soon to pass into the hands of you and your contemporaries, without the earnest wish that you have caught sight of your high calling, your vast possibilities, and inspiring duties. End of the Celebration of Intellect by Ralph Waldo Emerson.
A Few Parables by Arthur Schopenhauer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In a field of ripening corn, I came to a place which had been trampled down by some ruthless foot, and as I glanced amongst the countless stalks, every one of them alike, standing there so erect and bearing the full weight of the ear, I saw a multitude of different flowers, red and blue and violet. How pretty they looked as they grew there so naturally with their little foliage. But, thought I, they are quite useless. They bear no fruit. They are mere weeds, suffered to remain only because there is no getting rid of them. And yet, but for these flowers, there would be nothing to charm the eye in that wilderness of stalks. They are emblematic of poetry and art, which, in civic life, so severe, but still useful and not without its fruit, play the same part as flowers in the corn. There are some really beautiful landscapes in the world, but the human figures in them are poor, and you had better not look at them. The fly should be used as the symbol of impertinence and audacity, for whilst all other animals shun man more than anything else, and run away even before he comes near them, the fly lights upon his very nose. 2 Chinamen travelling in Europe went to the theatre for the first time. One of them did nothing but study the machinery, and he succeeded in finding out how it was worked. The other tried to get at the meaning of the piece in spite of his ignorance of the language. Here you have the astronomer and the philosopher. Wisdom which is only theoretical and never put into practice is like a double rose. Its colour and perfume are delightful, but it withers away and leaves no seed. No rose without a thorn, yes, but many a thorn without a rose. A wide-spreading apple-tree stood in full bloom, and behind it a straight fir raised its dark and tapering head. "Look at the thousands of gay blossoms which cover me everywhere," said the apple-tree. "What have you to show in comparison?" "Dark green needles." "That is true," replied the fir, "but when winter comes you will be bared of your glory, and I shall be as I am now." Once, as I was botanizing under an oak, I found amongst a number of other plants of similar height one that was dark in colour, with tightly closed leaves and a stalk that was very straight and stiff. When I touched it, it said to me in firm tones, "Let me alone. I am not for your collection, like these plants to which nature has given only a single year of life. I am a little oak. So it is with a man whose influence is to last for hundreds of years. As a child, as a youth, often even as a full-grown man, nay, his whole life long, he goes about among his fellows, looking like them and seemingly as unimportant. But let him alone. He will not die. Time will come and bring those who know how to value him. The man who goes up in a balloon does not feel as though he were ascending. He only sees the earth sinking deeper under him. There is a mystery which only those will understand who feel the truth of it. Your estimation of a man's size will be affected by the distance at which you stand from him, but in two entirely opposite ways, according as it is his physical or his mental stature that you are considering. The one will seem smaller, the farther off you move, the other greater. Nature covers all her works with a varnish of beauty, like the tender bloom that is breathed, as it were, on the surface of a peach or a plum. Painters and poets lay themselves out to take off this varnish, to store it up, and give it to us to be enjoyed at our leisure. We drink deep of this beauty long before we enter upon life itself. And when afterwards we come to see the works of nature for ourselves, the varnish is gone. The artists have used it up, and we have enjoyed it in advance. Thus it is that the world so often appears harsh and devoid of charm, nay, actually repulsive. It were better to leave us to discover the varnish for ourselves. This would mean that we should not enjoy it all at once and in large quantities. We should have no finished pictures, no perfect poems, but we should look at all things in that genial and pleasing light in which even now a child of nature sometimes sees them. Someone who has not anticipated his aesthetic pleasures by the help of art, or taken the charms of life too early. The cathedral in Mayence is so shut in by the houses that are built round about it, that there is no one spot from which you can see it as a whole. This is symbolic of everything great or beautiful in the world. It ought to exist for its own sake alone, but before very long it is misused to serve alien ends. People come from all directions wanting to find in it support and maintenance for themselves. They stand in the way and spoil its effect. To be sure, there is nothing surprising in this, for in a world of need and imperfection, everything is seized upon which can be used to satisfy want. Nothing is exempt from this service, no, not even those very things which arise only when need and want are for a moment lost sight of, the beautiful and the true, sought for their own sakes. This is especially illustrated and corroborated in the case of institutions, whether great or small, wealthy or poor, founded, no matter in what century or in what land, to maintain and advance human knowledge, and generally to afford help to those intellectual efforts which ennoble the race. Wherever these institutions may be, it is not long before people sneak up to them under the pretence of wishing to further those special ends, while they are really led on by the desire to secure the emoluments which have been left for their furtherance, and thus to satisfy certain coarse and brutal instincts of their own. Thus it is that we come to have so many charlatans in every branch of knowledge. The charlatan takes very different shapes according to circumstances, but at bottom he is a man who cares nothing about knowledge for its own sake, and only strives to gain the semblance of it, that he may use it for his own personal ends, which are always selfish and material. Every hero is a Samson. The strong man succumbs to the intrigues of the weak and the many, and if in the end he loses all patience, he crushes both them and himself, or he is like Gulliver at Lilliput, overwhelmed by an enormous number of little men. A mother gave her children Aesop's fables to read, in the hope of educating and improving their minds, but they very soon brought the book back, and the eldest, wise beyond his years, delivered himself as follows: "This is no book for us. It's much too childish and stupid. You can't make us believe that foxes and wolves and ravens are able to talk. We've got beyond stories of that kind. In these young hopefuls you have the enlightened rationalists of the future. A number of porcupines huddled together for warmth on a cold day in winter, but, as they began to prick one another with their quills, they were obliged to disperse. However, the cold drove them together again, when just the same thing happened. At last, after many turns of huddling and dispersing, they discovered that they would be best off by remaining at a little distance from one another. In the same way, the need of society drives the human porcupines together, only to be mutually repelled by the many prickly and disagreeable qualities of their nature. The moderate distance, which they at last discover to be the only tolerable condition of intercourse, is the code of politeness and fine manners, and those who transgress it are roughly told, in the English phrase, to keep their distance. By this arrangement, the mutual need of warmth is only very moderately satisfied, but then people do not get pricked. A man who has some heat in himself prefers to remain outside, where he will neither prick other people nor get pricked himself. End of A Few Parables by Arthur Schopenhauer. Read by Andrew Macbeth.
The House Divided Against Itself speech by Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation not only has not ceased, but is constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect that it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate that now almost complete legal combination piece of machinery, so to speak, compounded of the Nebraska Doctrine and the Dred Scott decision. Put this and that together, and we have another nice little niche, which we may, ere long, see filled with another Supreme Court decision, declaring that the Constitution of the United States does not permit a state to exclude slavery from its limits, and this may especially be expected if the doctrine of care not whether slavery be voted down or voted up shall gain upon the public mind sufficiently to give promise that such a decision can be maintained when made. Such a decision is all that slavery now lacks of being alike lawful in all the states. Welcome or unwelcome, such a decision is probably coming, and will soon be upon us, unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown. We shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state. To meet and overthrow that dynasty is the work before all those who would prevent that consummation. That is what we have to do. How can we best do it? There are those who denounce us openly to their own friends, and yet whisper to us softly that Senator Douglas is the aptest instrument there is with which to effect that object. They wish us to infer all from the fact that he now has a little quarrel with the present head of the dynasty, and that he has regularly voted with us on a single point, upon which he and we have never differed. They remind us that he is a great man, and that the largest of us are very small ones. Let this be granted. But a living dog is better than a dead lion. Judge Douglas, if not a dead lion, for this work, is at least a caged and toothless one. How can he oppose the advance of slavery? He does not care anything about it. His avowed mission is impressing the public heart to care nothing about it. A leading Douglas Democratic newspaper thinks Douglas's superior talent will be needed to resist the revival of the African slave trade. Does Douglas believe an effort to revive that trade is approaching? He has not said so. Does he really think so? But if it is, how can he resist it? For years he has labored to prove it a sacred right of white men to take Negro slaves into the new territories. Can he possibly show that it is less a sacred right to buy them where they can be bought cheapest? And unquestionably, they can be bought cheaper in Africa than in Virginia. He has done all in his power to reduce the whole question of slavery to one of a mere right of property, and as such, how can he oppose the foreign slave trade? How can he refuse that trade and that property shall be perfectly free, unless he does it as a protection to the home production? And as the home producers will probably ask the protection, he will be wholly without a ground of opposition. Senator Douglas holds, we know, that the man may rightfully be wiser today than he was yesterday, that he may rightfully change when he finds himself wrong. But can we, for that reason, run ahead and affirm that he will make any particular change, of which he himself has given no intimation? Can we safely base our action upon any such vague inference? Now, as ever, I wish not to misrepresent Judge Douglas's position, question his motives, or do aught that can be personally offensive to him. Whenever, if ever, he and we can come together on a principle, so that our cause may have assistance from his great ability, I hope to have interposed no adventitious obstacle. But clearly he is not now with us. He does not pretend to be. He does not promise ever to be. Our cause, then, must be entrusted to and conducted by its own undoubted friends, those whose hands are free, whose hearts are in the work, who do care for the result. 2 years ago the Republicans of the nation mustered over 1,300,000 strong. We did this under the single impulse of resistance to a common danger. With every external circumstance against us, of strange, discordant, and even hostile elements, we gathered from the four winds, and formed and fought the battle through, under the constant hot fire of a disciplined, proud, and pampered enemy. Did we brave all then, to falter now? Now, when that same enemy is wavering, dissevered, and belligerent, the result is not doubtful. We shall not fail. If we stand firm, we shall not fail. Wise counsels may accelerate, or mistakes delay it, but sooner or later the victory is sure to come. End of The House Divided Against Itself speech by Abraham Lincoln. Read by Cody Logan.
How to Make a Shoe by John Parker Hedley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Betsy Bush in Marquette, Michigan, April 2008. How to Make a Shoe by John Parker Hedley. Shoemakers are known both far and wide as men who always cut up side. Horse sometimes, also cow leather, to meet the changes in the weather. Sheep and goats are often slain, both unite to make it plain that sheep is used for lining nice, when goat alone would not suffice. Just so with calf as well as kid. Some use these linen lined, and think it quite the best for those who feel themselves refined. Refined or not, we think it true, our feet need some protection to do whatever they have to do. We make our own selection. Select at all times the best we can, both of shoemakers as well as shoes. This is much the better plan, and learns us how to choose. Introduction. The author of the book in hand, having passed through the various scenes through which he would accompany his readers, was prompted to make this offering to the craft and the public in order to relieve his mind of the thoughts had upon the subject of making shoes, as well as to contribute something of a literary character, which, in the broad sense of possibilities, may become useful as a text-book or family book for those who may feel interested in making or wearing shoes, and perhaps lead to something better. Realizing the imperfections and shortcomings of the human family, to some extent at least, no claim beyond that which you are disposed to put upon it is held, so that any communication will be gladly received and noted. This opportunity is also taken to express thanks for some valuable suggestions from the U.S. Bureau of Education and others concerning the publication of this little volume, and in its present shape you are invited to read and make the best use of it you can. Author. The subject seated on a chair, one knee the other to rest, has his measure taken fair, the foot at ease is best. The artist views the foot, and straightway takes the length, by measuring it from heel to toe, his size brings content. From 12 to 18 inches long, this stick has many sizes. 3 to the inch is now our song, subject to compromises. Some feet have long toes behind, in the language of the craft. These are not so hard to find, and oft to us been waft. Our artist here will best succeed if a little head he can measure, for out of this comes very much to make the feet a treasure. Next around the heel a strap we bring, to the centre of the curve. A leather or linen strap is used, and don't affect the nerve. The marks on this an inch represents, also fractions of inch preserved. When made complete, it then presents an appearance well deserved. Around the heel I've already said, but that is not quite so, for around in part and through instead will make it more the go. Now let us here make up our minds, if this trade we would study, that the craft is subject to many fines if the subject gets very muddy. With strap in hand the instep measure, be sure you get it right, for at this place some have a treasure which prompts them off to fight. A little lump we will it now call, not knowing the exact name of it, nor let our strap the least bit fall, but measure just above it. When we've done this, and done quite well, another move will follow, which takes us nearly on the ball, and brings us from the hollow. From the hollow now we've just come out, with strap in hand to take the measure neat near on the ball, so that our fits won't shake. If they should shake, the remedy comes, a false sole we do make. To please our subjects at their homes, the soles we there do take. Onward now the way we press, and move along just so, until we reach the part well known to be the toe, the toe. This is the place of which folks do talk, if there is any pressure, because they cannot easy walk, the shoey missed the measure. Just below the ball, across the toes, is where we next are found, for there is nothing worn like shoes when used upon the ground. From here we feel like soaring higher, and soon get at the ankle, which must be fit to suit the buyer, thus avoiding any wrangle. The ankle reached, we then with care measure neat and true. If anything is noticed there, 'twill surely be the shoe. That notice is just what we want, from that we get our living, and if we make a miss on that, it might be past forgiving. From toe to ankle we have come, with an uncertain height, and with the measures we've put down, we'll now add that right. To have the height right is our aim, some like shoes high, some low, but to have them fit is all the same, and this we try to show. Some in one way, some in another, these measures have been taken, until we have them all together, we should not try to shapen. To work now by our measure marked, will be our constant aim. A pattern must be cut, to start with that is plain. But plainer still the shoe will be from the pattern we shall cut, because we think you will all agree what's opened should be shut. Before our eyes the patterns come, the shapes are clearly seen, a vamp and quarter with a tongue worked just in between. A stiffening of soul has found its way, and asks that it be shown, in order at some future day its use might be made known. The parts, you see, stand thus alone, but have a close relation, because these parts must all be shown to keep their proper station. One part not seen, in shape the same, is cut and called the lining, upon which each quarter must be placed. We'll not stop here defining, but show in this cut, if you please, the lining a little larger, with the quarter passed on it smooth, if not there'll come a charger. The vamp, also, has been changed, only one half appears, the cause of which can be explained in less time than number years. When we the lower corners take, and match them well in fact, the centre we at once do make, which guides the following act. The act of uniting quarter and vamp, with paste or cement for sewing, is done with care, as in this cut the fitness of things is showing. The centre mark on the vamp we'll use, to get the quarters placed best, by putting the vamp upon the two, 1/2 inch above the rest. One end is reached, but not the last. This end from flax or cotton is made by some men very fast, if the flax is not too rotten. The work which we have now passed through could all be done by standing, having a board to cut upon, and one the paste commanding. But now we wish the scene to change, and begin the ending act, which comes first to him who would arrange the threads indeed intact. We roll the thread upon our knee to untwist and break with ease, and place the cords 1, 2, and 3, so that the points are formed, if you please. By having the points one below the other, the thread kept free from a knot, we will avoid whatever there is to bother, while the past may be forgot. We will let that be just as it may. If wrong, we'll try and mend it, for surely there will come a day when after all we'll send it. The figure now shows us how to twist it hard and harder. When one side is twisted hard enough, we simply take the other, and do the same thing over again, so that the threads are worked together. Before the ends are entirely free, one thing around us lingers. We take the thread, 3 or 2 in one, around our left-hand fingers. A large round awl is just the thing to do what we call milling. 2 or 3 trips are sure to bring from fingers to foot the filling. Now our thread is very smooth, but we try to make it smoother by using a piece of cloth to rub, when done, free altogether. Something now is sought that sticks, commonly known as wax, and often one gets in a fix when he finds it with the tacks. But wax, not tacks, is what we want, to make our thread quite nice. We catch it in the middle, and to the end wax thrice, each time waxing briskly, not stopping on the way, for if we do, we'll miss it, and perhaps we'll have to say. Our wax should be in season, soft wax in winter use, hard wax in summer reason, holding together our shoes. A fine point now we're about to make. This point should be waxed better, so that the bristle we may take shall stick like the stamp of a letter. We'll stop here about the thread, to take a little whistle, until we find a pair to suit, then begin to bristle. The bristles with care have been selected, in keeping with the thread. In this case we feel protected, because the hog is dead. From Russia, we are told, the best bristles come, but cannot tell you why the hairs upon our hogs at home are not so good to buy. The union of thread and bristles now will keep us to our text, for from this you'll no doubt see what is coming next. The bristle is split a little o'er half-way, in the left hand has its place, between the finger and thumb to play an important part in the race. One half o'er the forefinger you see, held in place by the next. The thread and bristle both agree to be thus placed is best. Do not split but roll it on, some have said and done, by waxing the bristle where the other is split, and continued from sun to sun. Now either way to start will do, as much depends on twisting. The hairy part is left for you to make sort of whisting. Back to the scene from whence we came, with this end in place to hasten. Make a hole quite through the thread, and point pass through and fasten. So much about the bristle said, no doubt you'll think it strange that needles are not used instead. Some have tried the change. They may be used with good effect in sewing through and through, but when we used a crooked awl, the bristle stands by true. One more remark about the end we thus have kept in view. To find the middle is the thing now left for us to do. Not very hard, but easy quite, in the left hand even joints. The right hand holding the other end, this fills up all the points. Another change in things takes place. This time the clamps appear. Between the knees they run their race, and hold the upper dear. The vamp and quarters, as they were pasted, are seen now in their place, the vamp extending above the clamps, with the quarters easy to trace. Begin to sew at extreme end, put left hand bristle first in. Across the vamp our sewing extend to rows that may be seen. This nicely done, just change a little, the position is clearly seen. When we have this quarter stitched near the back, say half-inch in between, pull through one thread and tie it tight on the inside to be left. Begin to sew the other quarter close at the vamp is right. Sew to the back, and then begin another row up the front. Sew to the top, 'twill be no sin, but the doing of what is wont. These rows half an inch apart will serve the present state, because now we have a splendid start, and getting on first rate. Then down the front, on the other side, to the vamp we sure to go. Never allow your work to slide, but take it out just so. The front is sewed, the back is not, but it will be very soon. This must never be forgot, as it takes up part the room. The outsides together at the back are seen, as we are about to sew, a little strip put in between to make it stronger grow. Down to the bottom we'll sew the way until it is complete, then trim the seam and rub it well with a bone found on the seat. You will observe the back is changed, the linings are together. This can be quite well arranged by whipping down this leather. Either whipping over and over, or through and through, just as the case may be. Neither way is very new, as we may clearly see. But we should do it and rub down flat, for now the time has come when we have had enough of that, and our upper is near done. The upper has now its right side out with care. A little stitching at the top of the back will make it look quite fair. We stopped stitching, you remember well, before we reached the back, when on the quarters we did dwell, and left a vacant back. This track now is filled up well, yet we do hold it fast, knowing that a time will come to put it on the last. Before that time is reached, however, the eyelets bear in mind, should each be put in proper place, so that the holes we find will let the strings pass easily through, when punched and set in straight. We have now the upper for our shoe. Do try and make the mate. This upper completed by the past has made it much a treasure, for we must also have a last, and fit it up to measure. Since we have kept our seat so long, a change may rest our back, so at the bench we'll take our stand, close by our friend the jack. The Bailey jack is the name of this, one screwed down upon the post. For general use it will not miss, but serve our end the most. Lasts are made of many woods, of ash, of oak, and maple. Well seasoned is this stock of goods, some kinds are very staple. Some are made with iron plates, to clinch the screw or nail, but when we would a peg shoe make, to use these plates would fail. Made also for men and boys, women and girls, for each has on this art a special claim, their feet to train and teach. To dwell here longer would not do, the last we wants in the hand. We'll measure the same as we did the foot, and thus our trade command. The length, you know, is measured first, 2 sizes added on, will make the toe so comfortable, we should like to sing a song. The heel we reach in perfect order, and leave the measure neat. Some shoes are made which look much broader, when put upon the feet. The instep now we see again, and measure as before, 1/2 inch off will answer us, no less and not much more. For if we do, we are apt to find the place where shoes do pinch. Across the ball we're now inclined, still measuring by the inch. This is at times a tender spot, bunions develop there, and when they do, 'tis not forgot, we may be e'er so fair. 1/4 size we leave off here, and on our way we go, travelling on without a fear until we reach the toe. Another quarter we would say, at this point we may drop, for we are now quite far away from the ankle and the top. But further yet we are bound to go, the bottom must be reached, where soles are made and often saved, though the saver be impeached. The last we put upon a side of white or red sole leather, and mark with knife or pencil wide the parts of sole together. The parts are known, each one defined, inner and outer sole. A middle one, when we are kind, lifts and shank piece make the whole. The inner sole on the last is put, the pegs just where you see. Keep the sole where it belongs, in order to agree. The edge is beveled with heel to heel, the mark across the breast shows us when and where we may take a little rest. The upper straight upon the last, with the seams appearing right, the stiffening smooth just at the back, will draw upon our sight. This should be done when we begin to draw the upper over, so that the last in all its parts shall have a proper cover. Draw steady until we have it close at the heel and at the toe. If these parts should be too loose, it would nearly spoil the shoe. Draw steady, or you'll make a crack, which will there remain, perhaps may cause us to go back, and do it over again. The upper in the way described, drawn gently at the toe, we hold it down with our left thumb, while a peg we try make go. On either side of the toe now work, and in the same way fasten, the upper down upon the sole, to the heel we now must fasten. Let the upper at the seam have now a secure tack, the stiffening all straight in between the lining and the back. Be sure you get the lining smooth, the part inside the shoe. If it is not, you may some time have a thing to make you blue. Now put the shoe upon the bench, in the way shown in the cut, and with a string and button use care to close the front. We no doubt now do see the thing taking on a shape, which in the end will surely bring us clear out of the scrape. The shoe is now placed on the jack, a hole for the pin in the last serves to keep the same intact, while the toe piece holds it fast. Now at the breast draw over outside, close upon the sole. Take your time, for something's gained while filling up the hole. The awl, you see, should not be large, in lasting use small pegs. Just drive them through the inner sole, no danger of your legs. We will now note the difference, the inside shank is longer. If we would last it very smooth, we must pull all the stronger. The thumbs at this are very clever, when their part is nicely played, serving as a splendid lever, while working in the shade. We are now at the inside ball, be careful not to scratch it. When in position we are found, we are more apt to catch it. When this we've caught, and feel safe to leave for the other side, we'll find the heel where the toe has been, by this we must abide. Everything quite in its place, the future for us yet. Let's last the upper all around, till at the toe we get. Still using all in pincer hands, alternating endly, for at this post we've taken stand to grow up very friendly. The toe has crimps, some in the heel, the first is more important, because the toe is always seen if rough becomes discordant. These crimps are made from left to right, and right to left we go, then scallop them when to be pegged, not so when it we sew. The shank piece in the bottom filled with crimps cut as we said, all ready for the middle sole, which forms an even bed, on which we lay the outer sole. The thing we look for next is moulded near the upper close, and comes quite near our text. The middle sole will make us have a better understanding, and help protect our feet from frost, while we the trade commanding. A strap is used around the foot, the shoe upon the knee, to mould the sole. As we have said, these parts should all agree. When moulded good, edge full from last, trim the sole prepared, then make a line for pegs to go, for in this we have shared. We to our old friend Jack make haste, with our awl and hammer bright, begin to peg on the line we've marked, 6 to the inch is right. 2 rows around, just in between, each other they are put. Use them long enough to go clear through, but save them from the foot. The awl hand picks up the pegs, the hammer hand now takes between forefinger and the thumb, and for the hole it makes. By repeating this we soon shall have our work ready for a lift, but first smooth pegs and trim heel seat, or we'll move along too swift. The first lift on will leave it full, making the center level. With our knife in hand, not very dull, we are prepared to bevel. In this way the heel is built, one lift upon the other. Pegging each will add no guilt, but save our subject bother. Piece by piece until we stop at the proper height. A solid piece used for the top will make it finish right. Nails are driven, both iron and steel, around the top in mind, and on the outside some prefer a few more nails to find. Hammer solid both heel and sole, level as it can be. Whittle the heel down to a size close to the nails you'll see. The heel shave is a tool so good to smooth the heel up nice, for when around it you have gone, its work will here suffice. Cut down the breast, make it square, sandpaper it if you please, then change position very fair, and done with perfect ease. Take out the welt with a knife to suit, do not cut the upper. This same thing is done to the boot, and neither has to suffer. These tools are bought in stores known to the craft as findings. Some are here from foreign shores, which serve us as a binding. A small knife take, and trim the edge from the heel around the toe. Down to the heel on the other side, our shoe begins to show. The bottom buffed, all but the top, sandpaper all, now we think. Just mark a place across the shank to be blackened well with the ink. The bottom in this shape has come, and looks as if we've parted, but that's not so, as we well know, we are nearer than when we started. The ink when burnished with hot kit, a little heel ball, is the thing to use so that it will be fit to put upon a king. Our Jack and company seen again, the last time for the present. To part perhaps will give us pain, perhaps be very pleasant. A burnisher for the heel behold, use bristly when we finish, for this tale is nearly told, its parts seem to diminish. Many parts have made the whole, some parts are much affected, but when the parts are whole in one, they do become respected. The end is reached, we trust all safe, after quite a travel. Though the road was rough from place to place, the thread did not unravel. J.P.H. Jr. End of How to Make a Shoe by John Parker Hedley.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Todd Cutler. A Meditation Upon a Broomstick by Jonathan Swift. This single stick, which you now behold ingloriously lying in that neglected corner, I once knew, in a flourishing state in a forest. It was full of sap, full of leaves, and full of boughs, but now in vain does the busy art of man pretend to vie with nature, by tying that withered bundle of twigs to its sapless trunk. 'Tis now, at best, but the reverse of what it was, a tree turned upside down, the branches on the earth, and the root in the air. 'Tis now handled by every dirty wench, condemned to do her drudgery, and, by a capricious kind of fate, destined to make other things clean, and be nasty itself. At length, worn to the stumps in the service of the maids, 'tis either thrown out of doors, or condemned to the last use of kindling a fire. When I beheld this, I sighed, and said within myself, surely mortal man is a broomstick. Nature sent him into the world strong and lusty, in a thriving condition, wearing his own hair on his head, the proper branches of this reasoning vegetable, till the axe of intemperance has lopped off his green boughs, and left him a withered trunk. He then flies to art, and puts on a periwig, valuing himself upon an unnatural bundle of hairs, all covered with powder that never grew on his head. But now should this our broomstick pretend to enter the scene, proud of those birchen spoils it never bore, and all covered with dust, though it be the sweepings of the finest lady's chamber, we should be apt to ridicule and despise its vanity. Partial judges that we are of our own excellencies, and other men's defaults. But a broomstick, perhaps you will say, is an emblem of a tree standing on its head, and pray what is man but a topsy-turvy creature, his animal faculties perpetually mounted on his rational, his head where his heels should be, grovelling on the earth? And yet, with all his faults, he sets up to be a universal reformer and corrector of abuses, a remover of grievances, rakes into every slut's corner of nature, bringing hidden corruptions to the light, and raises a mighty dust where there was none before, sharing deeply all the while in the very same pollutions he pretends to sweep away. His last days are spent in slavery to women, and generally the least deserving, till, worn to the stumps, like his brother besom, he is either kicked out of doors, or made use of to kindle flames for others to warm themselves by. That was A Meditation Upon a Broomstick by Jonathan Swift, read by Todd Cutler.
Morals of Chess by Benjamin Franklin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Philip Weichselbaum. Playing at chess is the most ancient and most universal game known among men, for its original is beyond the memory of history, and it has, for numberless ages, been the amusement of all the civilized nations of Asia, the Persians, the Indians, and the Chinese. Europe has had it above 1,000 years, the Spaniards have spread it over their part of America, and it begins lately to make its appearance in these estates. It is so interesting in itself as to not need the view of gain to induce engaging in it, and thence it is never played for money. Those, therefore, who have leisure for such diversions cannot find one that is more innocent, and the following piece, written with a view to correct, among a few young friends, some little improprieties in the practice of it, shews at the same time that it may, in its effects on the mind, be not merely innocent, but advantageous to the vanquished as well as the victor. The game of chess is not merely an idle amusement. Several valuable qualities of the mind, useful in the course of human life, are to be acquired or strengthened by it, so as to become habits ready on all occasions. For life is a kind of chess in which we have often points to gain and competitors or adversaries to contend with, and in which there is a vast variety of good and ill events that are, in some degree, the effects of prudence or the want of it. By playing chess, then, we may learn, first, foresight, which looks a little into futurity and considers the consequences that may attend an action, for it is continually occurring to the player, if I move this piece, what will be the advantage of my new situation? What use can my adversary make of it to annoy me? What other moves can I make to support it and to defend myself from his attacks? Second, circumspection, which surveys the whole chessboard or scene of action, the relations of the several pieces and situations, the dangers they are respectively exposed to, the several possibilities of their aiding each other, the probabilities that the adversary may take this or that move and attack this or the other piece, and what different means can be used to avoid his stroke or turn its consequences against him. Third, caution, not to make our moves too hastily. This habit is best acquired by observing strictly the laws of the game, such as, if you touch a piece, you must move it somewhere, if you set it down, you must let it stand. And it is therefore best that these rules should be observed, as the game thereby becomes more the image of human life, and particularly of war, in which, if you have incautiously put yourself into a bad and dangerous position, you cannot obtain your enemy's leave to withdraw your troops and place them more securely, but you must abide all the consequences of your rashness. And lastly, we learn by chess the habit of not being discouraged by present bad appearances in the state of our affairs, the habit of hoping for a favorable change, and that of persevering in the search of resources. The game is so full of events, there is such a variety of turns in it, the fortune of it is so subject to sudden vicissitudes, and one so frequently, after long contemplation, discovers the means of extricating oneself from a supposed insurmountable difficulty, that one is encouraged to continue the contest to the last, in hopes of victory by our own skill, or at least giving a stalemate by the negligence of our adversary. And whoever considers, what in chess he often sees instances of, that particular pieces of success are apt to produce presumption, and its consequent inattention by which the loss may be recovered, will learn not to be too much discouraged by the present success of his adversary, nor to despair of final good fortune upon every little check he receives in pursuit of it. That we may therefore be induced more frequently to choose this beneficial amusement in preference to others, which are not attended with the same advantages, every circumstance which may increase the pleasure of it should be regarded, and every action or word that is unfair, disrespectful, or that in any way may give uneasiness should be avoided, as contrary to the immediate intention of both the players, which is to pass the time agreeably. Therefore, first, if it is agreed to play according to the strict rules, then those rules are to be exactly observed by both parties, and should not be insisted on for one side, while deviated from by the other, for this is not equitable. Secondly, if it is agreed not to observe the rules exactly, but one party demands indulgences, he should then be as willing to allow them to the other. Thirdly, no false move should ever be made to extricate yourself out of a difficulty or to gain an advantage. There can be no pleasure in playing with a person once detected in such unfair practice. Fourthly, if your adversary is long in playing, you ought not to hurry him or express any uneasiness at his delay. You should not sing, nor whistle, nor look at your watch, nor take up a book to read, nor make a tapping with your feet on the floor, with your fingers on the table, nor do anything that may disturb his attention. For all these things displease, and they do not shew your skill in playing, but your craftiness or your rudeness. Fifthly, you ought not to endeavor to amuse and deceive your adversary by pretending to have made bad moves and saying that you have now lost the game, in order to make him secure and careless and inattentive to your schemes, for this is fraud and deceit, not skill in the game. Sixthly, you must not, when you have gained a victory, use any triumphing or insulting expression, nor show too much pleasure, but endeavor to console your adversary and make him less dissatisfied with himself, but every kind of civil expression that may be used with truth, such as, "You understand the game better than I, but you're a little inattentive," or "You play too fast," or "You had the best of the game, but something happened to divert your thoughts, and that turned it in my favor." Seventhly, if you're a spectator while others play, observe the most perfect silence. For if you give advice, you offend both parties. Him against whom you give it, because it may cause the loss of his game, him in whose favor you give it, because, though it be good and he follows it, he loses the pleasure he might have had if you had permitted him to think until it had occurred to himself. Even after a move or moves, you must not, by replacing the pieces, show how it might have been placed better, for that displeases, and may occasion disputes and doubts about their true situation. All talking to the players lessens or diverts their attention, and is therefore unpleasing. Nor should you give the least hint to either party by any kind of noise or motion. If you do, you are unworthy to be a spectator. If you have a mind to exercise or shew your judgment, do it in playing your own game, when you have an opportunity, not in criticizing or meddling with or counseling the play of others. Lastly, if the game is not to be played rigorously according to the rules above mentioned, then moderate your desire of victory over your adversary, and be pleased with one over yourself. Snatch not eagerly at every advantage offered by his unskilfulness or inattention, but point out to him kindly that by such a move he places or leaves a piece in danger and unsupported, that by another he will put his king in a perilous situation, etc. By this generous civility, so opposite to the unfairness above forbidden, you may, indeed, happen to lose the game to your opponent, but you will win what is better, his esteem, his respect, and his affection, together with the silent approbation and goodwill of impartial spectators. End of Morals of Chess by Benjamin Franklin. Night and Moonlight by Henry David Thoreau. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Philip Weichselbaum. Chancing to take a memorable walk by moonlight some years ago, I resolved to take more such walks and make acquaintance with another side of nature. I have done so. According to Pliny, there is a stone in Arabia called selenites, wherein is a white which increases and decreases with the moon. My journal for the last year or two has been selenitic in this sense. Is not the midnight like Central Africa to most of us? Are we not tempted to explore it, to penetrate to the shores of its Lake Chad, and discover the sources of its Nile, perchance the mountains of the moon? Who knows what fertility and beauty, moral and natural, are there to be found? In the mountains of the moon, in the Central Africa of the night, there is where all Niles have their hidden heads. The expeditions up the Nile as yet extend but to the cataracts, or perchance to the mouth of the White Nile, but it is the Black Nile that concerns us. I shall be a benefactor if I conquer some realms from the night, if I report to the gazettes anything transpiring about us at that season worthy of their attention, if I can show men that there is some beauty awake while they are asleep, if I add to the domains of poetry. Night is certainly more novel and less profane than day. I soon discovered that I was acquainted only with its complexion, and as for the moon, I had seen her only, as it were, through a crevice in a shutter, occasionally. Why not walk a little way in her light? Suppose you attend to the suggestions which the moon makes for 1 month, commonly in vain, will it not be very different from anything in literature or religion? But why not study the Sanskrit? What if one moon has come and gone with its world of poetry, its weird teachings, its oracular suggestions, so divine a creature freighted with hints for me, and I have not used her? One moon gone by unnoticed? I think it was Dr. Chalmers who said, criticizing Coleridge, that for his part he wanted ideas which he could see all around, and not such as he must look at away up in the heavens. Such a man, one would say, would never look at the moon, because she never turns her other side to us. The light which comes from ideas, which have their orbit as distant from the earth, and which is no less cheering and enlightening to the benighted traveller than that of the moon and stars, is naturally reproached or nicknamed as moonshine by such. They are moonshine, are they? Well, then do your night travelling where there is no moon to light you. But I will be thankful for the light that reaches me from the star of least magnitude. Stars are lesser or greater only as they appear to us so. I will be thankful that I see so much as one side of a celestial idea, one side of the rainbow, and the sunset sky. Men talk glibly enough about moonshine, as if they knew its qualities very well, and despised them, as owls might talk of sunshine. None of your sunshine, but this word commonly means merely something which they do not understand, which they are abed and asleep to, however much it may be worth their while to be up and awake to it. It must be allowed that the light of the moon, sufficient though it is for the pensive walker, and not disproportionate to the inner light we have, is very inferior in quality and intensity to that of the sun. But the moon is not to be judged alone by the quantity of light she sends to us, but also by her influence on the earth and its inhabitants. The moon gravitates toward the earth, and the earth reciprocally towards the moon. The poet who walks by moonlight is conscious of a tide in his thought, which is to be referred to lunar influence. I will endeavor to separate the tide in my thoughts from the current distractions of the day. I would warn my hearers that they must not try my thoughts by a daylight standard, but endeavor to realize that I speak out of the night. All depends on your point of view. In Drake's collection of voyages, Wever says of some albinos among the Indians of Darien, they are quite white, but their whiteness is like that of a horse, quite different from the fair or pale European, as they have not the least tincture of a blush or sanguine complexion. Their eyebrows are milk white, as is likewise the hair of their heads, which is very fine. They seldom go abroad in the daytime, the sun being disagreeable to them, and causing their eyes, which are weak and poring, to water, especially if it shines towards them, yet they see very well by moonlight, from which we call them moon-eyed. Neither in our thoughts in these moonlight walks, methinks, is there the least tincture of a blush or sanguine complexion, but we are intellectually and morally albinos, children of Endymion. Such is the effect of conversing much with the moon. I complain of Arctic voyagers that they do not enough remind us of the constant peculiar dreariness of the scenery, and the perpetual twilight of the Arctic night. So he whose theme is moonlight, though he may find it difficult, must, as it were, illustrate it with the light of the moon alone. Many men walk by day, few walk by night. It is a very different season. Take a July night, for instance. About 10 o'clock, when man is asleep and day fairly forgotten, the beauty of moonlight is seen over lonely pastures where cattle are silently feeding. On all sides novelties present themselves. Instead of the sun there are the moon and stars. Instead of the wood thrush there is the whippoorwill. Instead of butterflies in the meadows, fireflies, winged sparks of fire. Who would have believed it? What kind of cool, deliberate life dwells in those dewy abodes associated with the spark of fire? So man has fire in his eyes, or blood, or brain. Instead of singing birds, the half-throttled note of a cuckoo flying over, the croaking of frogs, and the intenser dream of crickets. But above all, the wonderful trump of the bullfrog ringing from Maine to Georgia. The potato vines stand upright, the corn grows apace, the bushes loom, the grain fields are boundless. On our open river terraces, once cultivated by the Indian, they appear to occupy the ground like an army, their heads nodding in the breeze. Small trees and shrubs are seen in the midst, overwhelmed as by an inundation. The shadows of rocks and trees and shrubs and hills are more conspicuous than the objects themselves. The slightest irregularities in the ground are revealed by the shadows, and what the feet find comparatively smooth appears rough and diversified in consequence. For the same reason, the whole landscape is more variegated and picturesque than by day. The smallest recesses in the rocks are dim and cavernous. The ferns in the wood appear of tropical size. The sweet fern and indigo in overgrown wood paths wet you with dew up to your middle. The leaves of the shrub oak are shining as if a liquid were flowing over them. The pools seen through the trees are as full of light as the sky. The light of the day takes refuge in the bosoms, as the Purana says of the ocean. All white objects are more remarkable than by day. A distant cliff looks like a phosphorescent space on a hillside. The woods are heavy and dark. Nature slumbers. You see the moonlight reflected from particular stumps in the recesses of the forest, as if she selected what to shine on. These small fractions of her light remind one of the plant called moonseed, as if the moon were sowing it in such places. In the night the eyes are partly closed and retire into the head. Other senses take the lead. The walker is guided as well by the sense of smell. Every plant and field and forest emits its odor now, swamp pink in the meadow and tansy in the road, and there is the peculiar dry scent of corn which has begun to show its tassels. The senses both of hearing and smelling are more alert. We hear the tinkling of rills which we never detected before. From time to time, high up on the sides of hills, you pass through a stratum of warm air, a blast which has come up from the sultry plains of noon. It tells the day of sunny noontide hours and bangs of the laborer wiping his brow and the bee humming amid flowers. It is an air in which work has been done, which men have breathed. It circulates about from woodside to hillside like a dog that has lost its master now that the sun is gone. The rocks retain all night the warmth of the sun which they have absorbed. And so does the sand. If you dig a few inches into it, you find a warm bed. You lie on your back on a rock in a pasture on the top of some bare hill at midnight and speculate on the height of the starry canopy. The stars are the jewels of the night, and perchance surpass anything which day has to show. A companion with whom I was sailing one very windy but bright moonlight night, when the stars were few and faint, thought that a man could get along with them, though he was considerably reduced in the circumstances, that they were a kind of bread and cheese that never failed. No wonder that there have been astrologers, that some have conceived that they were personally related to particular stars. De Bartas, as translated by Sylvester, says he will not believe that the great architect with all these fires the heavenly arches decked, only for show, and with these glistering shields to wake poor shepherds watching in the fields. He'll not believe that the least flower which pranks our garden borders, or our common banks, and the least stone that in her warming lap our mother earth doth covetously wrap, hath some peculiar virtue of its own, and that the glorious stars of heaven have none. And Sir Walter Raleigh well says, "The stars are instruments of far greater use than to give an obscure light, and for man to gaze on after sunset." And he quotes Plotinus as affirming that they are significant but not efficient, and also Augustine as saying, "Deus regit inferioria corpora per superioria." God rules the bodies below by those above. But best of all is this which another writer has expressed, "Sapiens adjuvabit opus astrorum, cemat modum agricola terrae naturam." A wise man assisteth the work of the stars, as the husbandman helpeth the nature of the soil. It does not concern men who are asleep in their beds, but it is very important to the traveller whether the moon shines brightly or is obscured. It is not easy to realize the serene joy of all the earth when she commences to shine unobstructedly, unless you have often been abroad alone in moonlight nights. She seems to be waging continual war with the clouds in your behalf. Yet we fancy the clouds to be her foes also. She comes on magnifying her dangers by her light, revealing, displaying them in all their hugeness and blackness, then suddenly casts them behind into the light concealed, and goes her way triumphant through a small space of clear sky. In short, the moon traversing, or appearing to traverse, the small clouds which lie in her way, now obscured by them, now easily dissipating and shining through them, makes the drama of the moonlight night to all watchers and night travellers. Sailors speak of it as the moon eating up the clouds. The traveller all alone, the moon all alone, except for its sympathy, overcoming with incessant victory whole squadrons of clouds above the forests and lakes and hills. When she is obscured, he so sympathizes with her that he could whip a dog for her relief, as Indians do. When she enters on a clear field of great extent in the heavens, and shines unobstructedly, he is glad. And when she has fought her way through all the squadron of her foes and rides majestic in a clear sky, unscathed, and there are no more any obstructions in her path, he cheerfully and confidently pursues his way, and rejoices in his heart, and the cricket also seems to express joy in its song. How insupportable would be the days if the night with its dew and darkness did not come to restore the drooping world. As the shades begin to gather around us, our primeval instincts are aroused, and we steal forth from the lairs, like the inhabitants of the jungle, in search of those silent and brooding thoughts which are the natural prey of the intellect. Richter says that the earth is every day overspread with the veil of night for the same reason as the cages of birds are darkened, namely, that we may the more readily apprehend the higher harmonies of thought in the hush and quiet of darkness. Thoughts which day turns into smoke and mist stand about us in the night as light and flames, even as the column which fluctuates above the crater of Vesuvius in the daytime appears a pillar of cloud, but by night a pillar of fire. There are nights in this climate of such serene and majestic beauty, so medicinal and fertilizing to the spirit, that methinks a sensitive nature would not devote them to oblivion, and perhaps there's no man but would be better and wiser for spending them out of doors, though he should sleep all the next day to pay for it. Should sleep an Endymion sleep, as the ancients expressed it, nights which warrant the Grecian epithet ambrosial, when, as in the land of Beulah, the atmosphere is charged with dewy fragrance and with music, and we take our repose and have our dreams awake, when the moon, not secondary to the sun, gives us his blaze again, void of its flame, and sheds a softer day. Now through the passing cloud she seems to stoop, now up the pure cerulean rides sublime. Diana still hunts in the New England sky. In heaven queen she's among the spheres. She, mistress-like, makes all things to be pure. Eternity in her oft change she bears, she beauty is, by her the fair endure. Time wears her nod, she doth his chariot guide, mortality below her orb is placed, by her the virtues of the star-stone slide, by her is virtue's perfect image cast. The Hindus compare the moon to a saintly being who has reached the last stage of bodily existence. Great restorer of antiquity, great enchanter, in a mild night when the harvest or hunter's moon shines unobstructedly, the houses in our village, whatever architect they may have had by day, acknowledge only a master. The village street is then as wild as the forest. New and old things are confounded. I know not whether I am sitting on the ruins of a wall or on the material which is to compose a new one. Nature is an instructed and impartial teacher, spreading no crude opinions and flattering none. She will be neither radical nor conservative. Consider the moonlight, so civil, yet so savage. The light is more proportionate to our knowledge than that of the day. It is no more dusky in ordinary nights than our mind's habitual atmosphere, and the moonlight is as bright as our most illuminated moments are. In such a night let me abroad remain, till morning breaks and all's confused again. Of what significance the light of day, if it is not the reflection of an inward dawn? To what purpose is the veil of night withdrawn, if the morning reveals nothing to the soul? It is merely garish and glaring. When Ocean, in his address to the sun, exclaims, "Where has darkness its dwelling? Where is the cavernous home of the stars, when thou quickly follows their steps, pursuing them like a hunter in the sky, though climbing the lofty hills, they descending on barren mountains? Who does not in his thoughts accompany the stars to their cavernous home, descending with them on barren mountains? Nevertheless, even by night the sky is blue and not black, for we see through the shadow of the earth into the distant atmosphere of day, where the sunbeams are reveling." End of Night and Moonlight by Henry David Thoreau.
The Oath and Law of Hippocrates by Hippocrates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Clarica. Introductory Note. Hippocrates, the celebrated Greek physician, was a contemporary of the historian Herodotus. He was born in the island of Kos between 470 and 460 B.C.,
and belonged to the family that claimed descent from the mythical Aesculapius, son of Apollo. There was already a long medical tradition in Greece before his day, and this he is supposed to have inherited chiefly through his predecessor Herodicus, and he enlarged his education by extensive travel. He is said, though the evidence is unsatisfactory, to have taken part in the efforts to check the great plague which devastated Athens at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. He died at Larissa between 380 and 360 B.C. The works attributed to Hippocrates are the earliest extant Greek medical writings, but very many of them are certainly not his. Some 5 or 6, however, are generally granted to be genuine, and among these is the famous oath. This interesting document shows that in his time physicians were already organized into a corporation or guild, with regulations for the training of disciples, and with an esprit de corps and professional ideal which, with slight exceptions, can hardly yet be regarded as out of date. One saying occurring in the words of Hippocrates has achieved universal currency, though few who quote it today are aware that it originally referred to the art of the physician. It is the first of his aphorisms. Life is short and the art long, the occasion fleeting, experience fallacious, and judgment difficult. The physician must not only be prepared to do what is right himself, but also to make the patient, the attendants, and externals cooperate. The Oath of Hippocrates. I swear by Apollo the physician, and Aesculapius, and health and all heal, and all the gods and goddesses, that, according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this stipulation: to reckon him who taught me this art equally dear to me as my parents, to share my substance with him, and relieve his necessities if required, to look upon his offspring in the same footing as my own brothers, and to teach them this art, if they shall wish to learn it, without fee or stipulation, and that by precept, lecture, and every other mode of instruction, I will impart a knowledge of the art to my own sons, and to those of my teachers, and to disciples bound by a stipulation and oath according to the law of medicine, but to none others. I will follow that system of regimen which, according to my ability and judgment, I consider for the benefit of my patients, and abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous. I will give no deadly medicine to any one if asked, nor suggest any such counsel, and in like manner I will not give to a woman a pessary to produce abortion. With purity and with holiness I will pass my life and practice my art. I will not cut persons laboring under the stone, but will leave this to be done by men who are practitioners of this work. Into whatever houses I enter, I will go into them for the benefit of the sick, and will abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption, and further, from the seduction of females or males, of freemen and slaves. Whatever, in connection with my professional practice, or not in connection with it, I see or hear in the life of men, which ought not to be spoken of abroad, I will not divulge, as reckoning that all such should be kept secret. While I continue to keep this oath unviolated, may it be granted to me to enjoy life and the practice of the art, respected by all men in all times. But should I trespass and violate this oath, may the reverse be my lot. The Law of Hippocrates. Medicine is of all the arts the most noble, but owing to the ignorance of those who practice it, and of those who, inconsiderately, form a judgment of them, it is at present far behind all the other arts. Their mistake appears to me to arise principally from this, that in the cities there is no punishment connected with the practice of medicine, and with it alone, except disgrace, and that does not hurt those who are familiar with it. Such persons are like the figures which are introduced in tragedies, For as they have the shape and dress and personal appearance of an actor, but are not actors, so also physicians are many in title, but very few in reality. Whoever is to acquire a competent knowledge of medicine ought to be possessed of the following advantages: a natural disposition, instruction, a favorable position for the study, early tuition, love of labor, leisure. First of all, a natural talent is required, for when nature leads the way to what is most excellent, instruction in the art takes place which the student must try to appropriate to himself by reflection, becoming an early pupil in a place well adapted for instruction. He must also bring to the task a love of labor and perseverance, so that the instruction taking root may bring forth proper and abundant fruits. Instruction in medicine is like the culture of the productions of the earth, for our natural disposition is, as it were, the soil. The tenets of our teachers are, as it were, the seed. Instruction in youth is like the planting of the seed in the ground at the proper season. The place where the instruction is communicated is like the food imparted to vegetables by the atmosphere. Diligent study is like the cultivation of the fields, and it is time which imparts strength to all things, and brings them to maturity. Having brought all these requisites to the study of medicine, and having acquired a true knowledge of it, we shall thus, in travelling through the cities, be esteemed physicians not only in name, but in reality. But inexperience is a bad treasure, and a bad fund to those who possess it, whether in opinion or reality, being devoid of self-reliance and contentedness, and the nurse both of timidity and audacity. For timidity betrays a want of powers, and audacity a lack of skill. They are indeed two things, knowledge and opinion, of which the one makes its possessor really to know, the other to be ignorant. Those things which are sacred are to be imparted only to sacred persons, and it is not lawful to impart them to the profane until they have been initiated in the mysteries of the science. End of The Oath and Law of Hippocrates by Hippocrates.
On the Pleasure of Taking Up One's Pen by Hilaire Belloc. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Among the sadder and smaller pleasures of this world, I count this pleasure, the pleasure of taking up one's pen. It has been said by very many people that there is a tangible pleasure in the mere act of writing, in choosing and arranging words. It has been denied by many. It is affirmed and denied in the life of Dr. Johnson, and for my part I would say that it is very true in some rare moods and wholly false in most others. However, of writing and the pleasure in it I am not writing here with pleasure, but of the pleasure of taking up one's pen, which is quite another matter. Note what the action means. You are alone. Even if the room is crowded, as was the smoking room in the GWR Hotel at Paddington only the other day, when I wrote my Statistical Abstract of Christendom, even if the room is crowded, you must have made yourself alone to be able to write at all. You must have built up some kind of wall and isolated your mind. You are alone, then, and that is the beginning. If you consider at what pains men are to be alone, how they climb mountains, enter prisons, profess monastic vows, put on eccentric daily habits, and seclude themselves in the garrets of a great town, you will see that this moment of taking up the pen is not least happy in the fact that then, by a mere association of ideas, the writer is alone. So much for that. Now, not only are you alone, but you are going to create. When people say create, they flatter themselves. No man can create anything. I knew a man once who drew a horse on a bit of paper to amuse the company and covered it all over with many parallel streaks as he drew. When he had done this, an aged priest, present upon that occasion, said, "You are pleased to draw a zebra." When the priest said this, the man began to curse and to swear, and to protest that he had never seen or heard of a zebra. He said it was all done out of his own head, and he called heaven to witness, and his patron saint, for he was of the old English territorial Catholic families, his patron saint was Athelstan, and the salvation of his immortal soul he also staked, that he was as innocent of zebras as the babe unborn. But there he persuaded no one, and the priest scored. It was most evident that the territorial was crammed full of zebraical knowledge. All this, then, is a digression, and it must be admitted that there is no such thing as a man's creating. But anyhow, when you take up your pen, you do something devilish pleasing. There is a prospect before you. You are going to develop a germ. I don't know what it is, and I promise you I won't call it creation, but possibly a god is creating through you, and at least you are making believe at creation. Anyhow, it is a sense of mastery and of origin, and you know that when you have done, something will be added to the world, and little destroyed. For what will you have destroyed or wasted? A certain amount of white paper, or a farthing a square yard, and I am not certain it is not pleasanter all diversified and variegated with black wriggles. A certain amount of ink meant to be spread and dried, made for no other purpose. A certain infinitesimal amount of quill, torn from the silly goose for no other purpose but to minister to the high needs of man. Here you cry, affectation, affectation. How do I know that the fellow writes with a quill? A most unlikely habit. To that I answer, you are right. Less assertion, please, and more humility. I will tell you frankly with what I am writing. I am writing with a waterman's ideal fountain pen. The nib is of pure gold, as was the throne of Charlemagne and the song of Roland. That throne, I need hardly tell you, was borne into Spain across the cold and awful passes of the Pyrenees by no less than 120 mules, and all the western world adored it, and trembled before it when it was set up at every halt under pine trees on the upland grasses. For he sat upon it, dreadful and commanding. There weighed upon him 2 centuries of age. His brows were level with justice and experience, and his beard was so tangled and full that he was called Bramble-bearded Charlemagne. You have read how, when he stretched out his hand at evening, the sun stood still till he had found the body of Roland? No? You must read about these things. Well, then, the pen is of pure gold, a pen that runs straight away like a willing horse or a jolly little ship. Indeed, it is a pen so excellent that it reminds me of my subject, the pleasure of taking up one's pen. God bless you, pen. When I was a boy and they told me work was honorable, useful, cleanly, sanitary, wholesome, and necessary to the mind of man, I paid no more attention to them than if they had told me that public men were usually honest or that pigs could fly. It seemed to me that they were merely saying silly things they had been told to say. Nor do I doubt to this day that those who told me these things at school were but preaching a dull and careless round. But now I know that the things they told me were true. God bless you, pen of work, pen of drudgery, pen of letters, pen of posings, pen rabid, pen ridiculous, pen glorified. Pray, little pen, be worthy of the love I bear you, and consider how noble I shall make you some day, when you shall live in a glass case with a crowd of tourists round you every day from 10 to 4. Pen of justice, pen of the saevae indignatio, pen of majesty and of light, I will write with you some day a considerable poem. It is a compact between you and me. If I cannot make one of my own, then I will write out some other man's. But you, pen, come what may, shall write out a good poem before you die, if it is only the Allegro. The pleasure of taking up one's pen has also this, peculiar among all pleasures, that you have the freedom to lay it down when you will. Not so with love, not so with victory, not so with glory. Had I begun the other way round, I would have called this work the pleasure of laying down one's pen. But I began it where I began it, and I am going to end it just where it is going to end. What other occupation, avocation, dissertation, or intellectual recreation can you cease at will? Not bridge. You go on playing to win. Not public speaking. They ring a bell. Not mere converse. You have to answer everything the other insufficient person says. not life, for it is wrong to kill oneself, and as for the natural end of living, that does not come by one's choice. On the contrary, it is the most capricious of all accidents. But the pen you lay down when you will. At any moment, without remorse, without anxiety, without dishonor, you are free to do this dignified and final thing. I am just going to do it. You lay it down. End of On the Pleasure of Taking Up One's Pen by Hilaire Belloc. Read by Neil Donnelly.
On the Vice of Novel Reading by Young E. Allison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. On the Vice of Novel Reading, being a brief in appeal, pointing out errors of the lower tribunal. Paper read before the Western Association of Writers at Winona Park, Indiana, June 29, 1897, by Young E. Allison. Ever since the novel reached the stage of development where it was demonstrated to be the most ingenious vehicle yet designed for conveying the protean thought and fancy of man, there has stood in the judgment book of public opinion the decree that novel reading was a vice. Of course, that judgment did not apply exclusively to the reading of novels. It was a sort of supplementary decree in which the name of this new invention was specifically added to the list of moral beguilements against which that judgment had anciently stood. Poetry, the drama, even the virtuous history, had had their noses disjointed by this tribunal. But their great age and the familiarity of their presence had softened the decree in its enforcement. The novel was a young offender in aspect, though he had the nature and inheritance of the other three, and was besides strong in masculinity and virility. A certain sympathy thus sprung up for the three quaint old ladies, as for old offenders whose persistence had won the wink of toleration. They actually achieved a certain facetious respectability in comparison with the fresher and more active dangers afforded by the novel. But the novel was simply a combination of all three, more flexible and adaptable. It therefore merely shares in the old judgment directed against everything in literature, and in all the arts, that displays the seductiveness of fancy or taste. The judgments of public opinion have been consistently in the line of distrusting and discrediting everything that appeared to be purely spiritual and intellectual, and that could not at once be organized into a political or religious institution, or into a mechanical industry with the prospect of large sales and quick profits. Novel reading is a vice, then, under this judgment, just as the reading of all fictions, fancies, inventions, and romances in all their forms, poetic, dramatic, and narrative. And if the reading is a vice, the writing of them, in all common sense, can be no less than murder or arson. If it is a vice to devote time to the reading of novels, it must be a crime to professionally pander to and profit by the vice. And if all this is true, what a wonderfully attractive corner that must be in Hades, where old Homer and the ever-young Aristophanes, Sophocles and Aeschylus, Dante, Virgil, and Boccaccio, Shakespeare and Molière, Goethe and Hugo, Balzac and Thackeray, Scott and Dumas, Dickens and that wonderful child of Bohemia who lately lay down to rest on Vailima Mountain. Think of all these marvelous aeons of genius gathered together for their meet punishment. In one especially warm corner, perhaps, Lope Felix de Vega, the most incorrigible of all, slowly expiating upon some most ingeniously uncomfortable gridiron the 1,160 volumes of crime and vice that are to be set down against him in the indictment, if it be a true bill. We may wonder whether the unknown authors of Esther and the Song of Songs and the psychological novel of Job are there too, where they properly belong. It must be a great Congress with these chief criminals as the senators, and a lower house made up of the most agreeably vicious souls of earth, who in their sojourn here yielded for a moment to siren voices. If everything in fiction, from the astonishing conspiracies overthrown by Old Sleuth to the magnificent visions that old John Milton saw of incarnate ambition like a branded criminal driven out before the radiant hosts of heaven, if all the fiction that makes up the spirit of the novel is included in this index expurgatorius of eternity, then we may well have a doubt, my friends, whether hell can hold us all. It is a curious exercise for persons immersed in writing and study as an occupation, and possessing a Catholic tolerance for all occupations, to hark back to the time when they were still within the jurisdiction of the world that acts but does not study. In all the average towns, hamlets, and countrysides of the world, human nature beats with exactly the same pulse. If a change come, it comes slowly, and it changes altogether, so that all are still alike. In the small towns, novel reading has been considered about as contemptuously as playing the fiddle, though admitted to be less dangerous than family card playing. It was estimated that a novel reader was confirming his indolence, and in danger of coming to the poorhouse. A fiddler was prophesied to get into jail for vagrancy or larceny, while a card player had entered a path that might lead as far as the gallows and comprehend all the crimes. This opinion still largely exists in towns and countrysides. We find it maintaining itself even in large cities, among all sorts of very good people, even among the most exceptional men of business, of the professions, and of the pulpits. Novel reading as a mental vice, according to this opinion, may be compared with opium eating as a moral vice. It is thought to enervate and corrupt by a means of a luxurious excitement, purely fictitious and temporary. At an annual meeting of members of the public library of a large city, the librarian read the aggregate number of calls for books of each class during the year. Let us assume that there were calls for 65,000 works of fiction, 5,000 of history and biography, 2,000 of science and philosophy, and say 75 of theology. One of the trustees, who had pretensions as to responsibility for the public conscience that would have dwarfed the pyramid of Cheops, arose and appealed to the members to suggest a plan for counteracting the deplorable tendency of the times to the reading of fiction. It did not occur to anybody to recommend the abolition of the printing press, and so a discussion began. One of the most distinguished and scholarly ministers and educators of the world, who was a member, came to the rescue of the novel. He said, in substance, that the large majority of the men and women in the world were laborers for the bread they ate, and it was his opinion that when such persons were resting after the day's toil, indulging their leisure, it was impossible to expect them to read works on theology and the abstruse sciences, while it was natural for them to seek amusement in novels and romances. He thought reading novels was much better than idle gossip, or loitering in saloons or in the streets. His remarks were received with great applause, and this declaration of his liberality of opinion was widely commented upon. But is there any real liberality in considering the reading of novels as only just a better use of one's leisure time than gossiping, guzzling in saloons, or wandering idly about the streets? The idea that novel reading has no value except as a relaxation and amusement is born of the same dense and narrow ignorance which concludes that alcoholic drinks and wine serve no real purpose but to promote drunkenness and wife-beating, that opium promotes only luxurious debauchery, and that all the elegant, graceful, and beautiful ceremonies and customs of society are invented merely to amuse and gratify the vain selfishness of the rich. The most curious aspect of novel reading, considered as a vice, is that the great majority of those indulging in it, like those who indulge in drinking, gambling, and other vices, are themselves willing to admit that it is indefensible, if less perilous than other vices. They excuse it, just as the distinguished minister did, as an amusement so harmless, as compared with other vices, that you may indulge in it and yet skirt hellfire by a margin of 1,000,000 miles. Some hypocrites conceal and deny the indulgence, like your secret toper. Others apologize for not indulging when they are in the company of notorious but pleasing offenders, as the hypocrite feigns benevolence. Every one of you doubtless has in mind the amiable man of business, maybe your tailor, your broker, your banker, your lawyer, your grocer, who cultivates your good opinion, and for the sake of the customer in you, tolerates lightly the doubtfulness of your employment. He will even introduce the subject of books as a respectful and diplomatic concession to your heresies, much as all of us humor lunatics amiably and curiously by broaching the subject of their delusions. He is tolerant because of fat success. His income is large. He spends it in a fine house full of costly adornments, of which he has no knowledge except in the measure of cost and the correctness of their usage. He has equipages, and gives dinners, and sits securely in Abraham's bosom of society. He pays you the deferential compliment of asking what books you are reading. It may be you are just out of the profound philosophical complexities and pathetic problems of Les Miserables, Perhaps you have immersed yourself again in the paradoxes of Vanity Fair, or have been pumping up the flabby tires of your better nature with the fresh air of David Copperfield. It is possible that Tess of the D'Urbervilles, or A Window in Thrums, has been newly received, and has been enlightening your mind and conscience as to your relations to the world about you. Whatever it has been, you suggest the fact. Is it a novel? He replies doubtfully. Certainly, you respond with enthusiasm. A masterpiece. Well, protests the amiable Philistine, I have so little time for amusing myself, you know. My daughter, now, she is a great novel reader. She buys a great many novels. Last year I read a book called The Greatness of Our Country. It is a wonderful book. It said in that book that the United States could support a population of 400 million. I had no idea of that before. I asked Professor So-and-so about it, and he said, why not? That China had 400 million people. It is surprising what we learn from books, etc., etc., etc. This man has got one bald statistical suggestion in his head out of a book that is made to sell on trains. He recognizes it. It recalls dimly mathematics, which he was taught at school. It is a concrete suggestion. It requires no effort to understand or remember. It is so wonderful to him that he has no time to amuse himself with the heart allegories and the practical questions of the condition of those possible 400 million, as revealed in Les Miserables. His daughter will do that, and he buys for her novels, bicycles, gloves, and chocolates, with equal fond readiness to humor what he considers whims pardonable in children. The idea that novel reading is a harmless and mere amusement expresses fully the judgment that it is a vice, an encourager of indolence. There may be two reasons for the judgment, one existing in the novel itself, the other in the tribunal. Let us first consider the nature of the tribunal. The supreme constituted authority, not only of affairs in this life, but in the ordering of all the future existences that man has conceived, is public opinion. Public opinion is the decree of human nature, determined in impenetrable secrecy, enforced with ceremonious and bewildering circumlocution. It is thus double-natured. The organized public opinion that we see, hear, feel, and obey is the costumed officialism of human nature, through ages of custom charged with enforcing upon individuals the demands of the many. The other is that tacit and nearly always unconscious understanding among men and women which binds them in mysterious cohesion through a belief in or a dread of something that they cannot understand, because they cannot feel it in their hands, control it with their strength, or disturb it with their threats. The myriads of mankind in this secret tribunal are silent because they are ignorant of speech. They are dull of brain and low in nervous organization, so that perception with them is a cerebral agony, and even feeling responds only to the shock of actual physical suffering. Organized public opinion, when compared with this unnameable and resistless silent force of human instinct, is like a small body of the police in the presence of a vast sullen mob. If the mob is determined and throws capable leaders forward, the police either desert to the mob or disappear. If the mob does not understand itself and produces no leaders, the police rule it. It is fair to speak of this tacit common instinct as ignorant, because the world always has been shared between ignorance and his twin brother, indolence. Knowledge is the rarest coin that circulates among men. No one can accumulate knowledge unless he possesses the broad catholicity of purpose to labor ceaselessly for truth, to accept it from whatsoever source it comes, in whatsoever guise, with whatsoever message it brings him, and to abide whatsoever result may follow. If he expects an angel and a devil comes, it is still the truth he is seeing, it is still knowledge he is gaining. The genius of knowledge-seeking was glorified in that obscure German chemist who, experimenting upon himself with a new solution into which a fatal wrong ingredient had entered, cried in the agony of death to his assistant, "Note my symptoms carefully and make an autopsy. I am sure it is a new poison we have liberated." If the vast majority of men shrink from and evade irksome labor with their muscles, even though life and comfort depend upon it, a still vaster majority shirk the disciplined toil and tension of the mind, which, if it have a real purpose, makes little of the only rewards that spur men to muscular labor. The men who have really thought and labored and struggled for the abstract jewel of truth and to beautify and make happy the world we live in, are to the masses of indolent, ignorant, selfish human beings that have swarmed through the ages, as parasites upon some huge animal. The mass of humanity considered as a whole, separated from these restless and stinging parasites, observed through the perspective of history, tradition, and science, resembles nothing so much as some monstrous, dull-brained, and gloomy animal, alternately dozing and raging through the centuries, now as if stupefied in its own bulk, and then as if furious with the madness of brute power. In fact, though mankind have achieved the dignity of a history that fills the thoughtful with wonder, yet as a mass they are filled with as much violence, injustice, ruthlessness, and selfishness as if it were but yesterday they had emerged from the primitive struggles with wild beasts, the tangled forests, the trackless mountains, and the pitiless elements, and yet stood flushed with savage exultation, but dull with physical weariness. In that vast human bulk that sprawls over every continent, the primitive ferocity still exists, veiled perhaps under familiar livery and uniform, but untamed by centuries of training. It is this gloomy mass, saturated with superstitious cowardice, savage with the selfish instinct of greed, or dull with the languor of gorged and exhausted passion, that deliberates not in words or thought, but in some impenetrable freemasonry of instinct, like that which beggars illustrate when they silently display their deformities and mutilations as the most eloquent appeals. This gloomy mass is at once the instigator and the instrument of mortal destiny. Individuals may escape for a time, but they must eventually fall or lift the mass to meet them. The most profound philosophers and most patient students know as little of this silent, gloomy human force as geographers know of the archipelagos of the Antarctic. The philosopher begins with pure reason and expands it. The student delves into the records of other students. In unfathomable depths below both are the myriads who eat, drink, sleep, and seek their prey as their primitive parents once did when they disputed carcasses with the beasts of the forests. It is this gloomy, savage force that has made the contemplative soul of spiritual inquiry writhe under the startling contradictions of history. When this force has been aroused with fear, it has snarled and roared defiance. When it has been enraged by opposition or the lash of mastership, it has cooled its ferocity in the blood of countless wars, pillages, and sacrifices. When satiated or pleased, it has grunted with pleasure, or relaxed itself in orgies so gross and unspeakable that modern history, with instinctive decency, has kept the story of them veiled behind dead languages. This gloomy, savage force has always been the same, whether mastered or mastering. When some daring and cunning genius of its own nature has cowed it, as the Alexanders, Caesars, and Napoleons have done, it has marched out to slaughter and be slaughtered, with a sullen pride in the daring that this mightier ferocity has put upon it. When it has mastered its Drusus, its Domitian, its Nero, its Vespasian, and its Louis XVI, it has indulged in wanton excesses of rage and destruction, until, spent with exhaustion, a new master has arisen to tie it up like a whipped dog. It was this gloomy and savage force that crowded into the greatest tribunal of all history, and yelled with discordant and frenzied rage into the very face of the noblest and gentlest incarnation of spiritual light that ever spent its brief moment on earth. Crucify him! Release unto us Barabbas the thief! It was this savage force, serving all masters with equal ferocious zeal, that Theodosius turned against Serapion at Alexandria in the name of Christianity, to blot out of existence the inestimable treasures of knowledge and literature that had been accumulated by centuries of labor. At all times this gloomy force has been more wantonly cruel than wild beasts. Man has been epigrammatically described as a reasoning animal, a laughing animal, a constructive animal, and even as an animal that gets drunk. But the truest description is that he is the cruel and rapacious animal. The greatest student of the jungle, who has written of the beasts of the forest with the intuition of genius, has given us this formula. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. Ye may kill for yourselves and your mates and your cubs, as they need and ye can, but kill not for pleasure of killing, and 7 times never kill man. You may spend the remainder of your life attacking that formula of animal nature if you please, but you will find it at last still truth. Man kills not only the beasts, but his own species for pleasure, or in sheer wantonness of cruelty. He loves killing as an exercise. He loves it as a spectacle. He loves it as the origin of his greatest emotion. When that there is merely a brutish criminal to be hanged, human beings crowd the converging roads to the spectacle as centuries ago they crowded to the Colosseum. And it is to be recorded to the credit of wild beasts that no traveler ever yet came upon a battlefield that they had strewn with the dead bodies of their own kind. Lest it be contended that this is a psychological portrait of the mass of mankind caricatured by bitter cynicism, let us examine the aspect of its physiology. The whole brain of an average Caucasian makes up 50 ounces of the 140 pounds weight of his body. There are thus 137 pounds of fleshy necessity to 3 pounds of intellectual possibility, 46 parts of heavy dough to 1 part of leaven. The difference in the brain weight of races, and which decides the question of intellectual superiority, is about 2 ounces. The difference in the brain weight of individuals of the same race, indicating mental superiority, is about 2 ounces. Now, as the brains of individuals of all races must in proportion be equally occupied with the execution of those functions which we call instinct, and those acts that may be called merely automobile, since they are the results of training and constant imitation, and have utterly no relation to intellectuality or mental initiative, it may be fairly assumed that the spiritual essence of races and individuals exists in a little grayish pulp-like lump of brain weighing 2 ounces out of an average bodily weight of 140 pounds. In the mass of humanity, then, there is 1 part possible to flower into the noble perceptions of spiritual and intellectual life, to 1,120 parts of dull, uniform, automatic animalism. What chance has this solitary microbe of spiritual and intellectual light against the swarming bacteria of animalism? That single microbe is merely a possibility. It may be mutilated, it may be dwarfed, it may fail from weakness, it may be corrupted. It is discouraging to think how few have grown into strong life through all the perils of existence. Under these circumstances, it is but natural that even the small proportion of mankind endowed with the divine possibilities conferred by 2 ounces of brain, should be contaminated with many of the corruptions from below. Of those who seem to be concerned with spiritual perceptions, there is a vast number mere charlatans and pretenders who, like the ingenious Japanese, are content to make cunning imitations of the real things adapted to sell to the best advantage. They patter formulas of religion, of science, of art and morals, and ostentatiously display themselves in the costume of intellectuality to flatter, cajole, and mystify the gloomy ignorance of their fellows. This is the select officialism of the secret human nature, its recognized and authorized police, the constituted authorities of public opinion. It is among these that we shall find the possibilities of development much increased. What do we find? That the solitary microbe merely begins its struggle here. It dare not destroy its swarming enemies, since upon their continued existence its own life depends. It must regulate, control, and direct them if it would live and develop, or with cowardly cunning compromise the struggle at the outset and become a servant where it seems to command. This is the first terrace step of superiority peopled by those who can understand others above them and interpret to the mass below. The microbe that might have become glorious ounces of brain has been content to become merely a little wart of pulp that finds expression in skill and quickness and more of coveted leisure. There is the next higher terrace, and another, until finally it becomes a pyramid, ever more fragile and symmetrical, the apex of which is a delicate spire, where the purest intellects are elevated to an ever-increasing height in ever-decreasing numbers, until in the dizzy altitude above the groveling base below, they are wrapped little by little in the cold solitude of incarnate genius, burning like suns with their own essence. It is so far up that the eyes deceive, and men dispute who it is that stands at the top, but whoever he may be, he has carried by the force of strength, determination, and patient will the whole swarm of his evil bacteria with him. They swarm through every terrace below, increasing in force as the pyramid enlarges downward. It is the pyramidal bulk of human nature with its finest brain, true to anatomic principles, at the top. That radiance at the summit is the delight and the aspiration of all below. As it rises as slowly as growth of a coral reef, it increases the courage of those below in proportion as they are near. But the whole bulk is alive with the bacteria of animalism, under increasing control as it rises, still with the ferocity, rapacity, and selfish passions of the gloomy mass at the bottom, and forever in revolt. Is this not proved by history, written and unwritten? Is it not proved by the ghastly secrets of individual introspection that men never reveal or admit to others, secrets guarded by a system of conventions so impenetrable and vast that to attempt to personalize it in the sneaking figure of hypocrisy would be as absurd as to try to enlarge the significance of an ivory chessman by setting it up on a lady's jewel box and naming it Moloch. All men feel how much of them is brute and how much is reason, but it is the unimpartable secret of human society whose betrayal has been rendered impossible by universal denials in advance, enacted into what we call criminal laws, under which admissions are denied by the brand of proportionate infamies, to demonstrate that the traitor who has acted or spoken has not put into expression the secrets of the mass. Great armies and constabularies are kept to commit upon a large scale the murders and violence which, when committed upon a small scale, they punish. What is the record of the officialism of public opinion? There has been nothing so abhorrent and cruel, so sordid, mean, frivolous, indecent, or insane, that the representative fashion and respectability of some splendid civilization has not justified, approved, and sustained it. It has licensed every wanton passion of the body. It has even indulged, contemptuously at times, those individuals inspired through the mysterious selection of immortal genius to safeguard the slender flame of spiritual light and life. But those indulged have always been made to feel that they were secure only as long as their performances excited jaded appetites as a novelty. If dwarfs and monstrosities staled, if dancing girls paled, if gladiators wearied, if there were no new games invented, then bring in a poet or artist, some queer fellow who had discovered something that he called truth or beauty, and let him amuse. But if he does not amuse, or if he wear out his welcome, away with him. In the history of our own civilization, as our ideals go, there was one divine incarnation of spiritual and intellectual life that struggled through the tears, blood, and dirt of existence, without one stain upon the purity of his nature. This essence was a beacon light that has shone steadily through nearly 2,000 years, and him the officialism of human nature, an exaltation of savage contempt, nailed upon a cross and set up for an ominous warning to the whole world. It had already marked the noble Socrates, and, like Cleopatra to her slave, handed him a cup of poison. It was afterward to compel Galileo to swallow in shame and agony his testimony to unalterable truth. Even in this year, under the title of a great church, it has, with pitiless persistence, forced a great student and educator not to deny a historical fact that he had discovered, but to humbly regret its promulgation. As if the concealment of a truth for your advantage in moral controversy were not a greater crime than the concealment of a murderer for pay. Whenever this officialism has concluded to amuse itself with spiritual inquiries in the name of religious controversies, it has conducted them with fire and the sword, with thumbscrews and the boot, and all manner of ingenious ferocity. The officialism of public opinion has always been ready to serve the demands of the base nature below. It was the great lawgiver, Lycurgus, who taught Spartan youths the commercial economy of theft and the virtue and advantage of lying. It was not only when Rome was in decay, but when she was at the zenith of glory from the first Brutus to Octavius, when Caesar, Cicero, Seneca, Horace, and the Plinies lived at the seat of the knowledge, wealth, art, and power of the world, that women crowded the Colosseums to feast their senses upon the ferocity of tigers and give the death signal to the gladiator who charmed by his fatal skill. It was while Shakespeare lived that English gentlemen and mothers apprenticed their son to the trade of piracy. In our own century and country we have seen Abraham Lincoln, the liberator himself, enlist under the flag of official public opinion to strike a blow in the extermination of Red Indians who had committed the unpardonable crime of owning their own land whereupon we are assembled today. The fashions of lust and cruelty may change with the amusements they permit, but officialism promotes all with zeal. At present we laugh at Mesmer and study hypnotism. At present we sneer at the incarnations of Vishnu and inquire into theosophy. At present we condemn the sacrificial great custom of King Prempeh and order our killings by 12 men and the sheriff and by elaborate machinery. At present we shudder at the sports of Commodus and wait breathlessly upon bulletins from Carson City. Those who scouted the fetishes of Dahomey have waited on their knees in the cathedral at Naples for the liquefaction of the blood of St. Januarius, or crawled in agony of hope to the saving pool at Lourdes. There have been those melted to tenderest compassion at the sight of a wounded dog or an overdriven horse, who have yet owned human slaves and contended that it was right, even if harsh, to sell a mother and her child from one auction block to different owners. There have been those so wounded by the shortcomings of their neighbors that they have organized white-capped bands of virtue to wipe out immorality in the cleansing blood of murder. A man may reject the miracle of Jonah and yet see an airship. Now this is the tribunal that has handed down the judgment that novel reading is a vice. Is it not a most natural, just, and honest opinion? Could such a tribunal properly pronounce any other? Is it not such a judgment in fact as vindicates the integrity of the court, while it crowns the culprit with glory? In expressing the idea that the reading of novels is only an amusement, to be taken up when there is nothing else to do, your average grocer, tailor, lawyer, or what-not has but spoken to you the world's judgment. In fact, there are countless readers of novels who have grown up in this atmosphere of conviction that novels are meant only to amuse. They are so habituated to the idea that novels, to them, are valueless, mere sentimental unrealities or spiced narratives of heated invention, so that they go through the treasure houses of genius without ever hearing the soft-voiced persuasion of knowledge or seeing the marvelous, vivid panorama of human life, illustrating its aspirations, sorrows, struggles, triumphs, and failures. Such readers, convinced in advance that everything in a novel is fictitious, because the personages discussed are fictitious in name, never dream that study of the conduct of these personages may be useful to influence their own manners, conduct, morals, or sympathies. Indeed, some of them are so confident of the unreality of novels that when they are confronted with their own counterparts in fictitious personality, they feel a certain sense of humiliation, as of being convicted of eccentricity, of an unlikeness to actual persons, which must be concealed as branding them fit to be put into a novel. To such persons novel reading is a vice, because it is an indolent excitement, a mental opium eating, the useless butting against an unscalable wall of brains intended to be fully occupied in developing those parts of the nervous and muscular systems that find their highest application in vigorous devotion to the washboard or the laying of gas pipes down. What a different result is achieved by the reader who knows the secret that imagination is the soul of thought, that taste is the power of truth, and that the abstractions produced by imagination and taste dealing with fact to convert it to fiction, or carefully assembling fiction to convert it to fact, have been the stars that have lighted up the night of human history. By the light of these in their varying forms, man discovered religion, philosophy, science, government, and the possibility of orderly liberty. To such a reader, the novel comprehends all human society, its customs and secrets. The untraveled man may sit in his library and become as familiar with the world as with his native town. The diffident student may mingle familiarly in the society of courts. The bashful girl may learn the most engaging manners. The slow may learn the trick of wit. The rich may learn sympathy for the poor. The weak may be warned against the pitfalls of temptation, and every one may there survey himself in every aspect, subjected to discussion and exhibition, under various disguises and under various circumstances, and if he have courage and the desire, he can decide what he thinks of himself and the possibilities of improving the opinion in the light of full knowledge of the subject. The novel has come as the solvent of all literary art. In its possibilities all the essentials of other literary forms are combined and conveyed without injury. Professedly not history, it performs all its wonders in the guise of history, and adds a light and a human interest to chronicle that gives increased value. We do not get sympathetic and human knowledge of England from history, but from Scott, Thackeray, and her splendid historical novelist. We do not turn to Guizot and Thiers for any knowledge of French history except its stated public facts, its documents with royal seals, and its verified dates and details. It is to Dumois, Merimée, Balzac, that all but the professional students of history go. We do not seek in the rapid sketches of Gibbon for the story of Nero, but in the pages of Quo Vadis. Where do we find the breathing history of Spain except in the countless novels that its picturesque subjects have suggested? I would scorn to underestimate the profound and substantial value that the great muse of history has conferred upon the world. In all literature she deservedly ranks first in dignity, power, and usefulness. But who will say that at her court the Prime Minister is not the novel, which by its lightness, grace, and address has popularized history all over the world? While the novel has none of the guise of poetry, yet it has its every essence, neglecting only form and rhyme. In the novel you may find the measure, the accent, and the figures of the whole range of poetry, and a capacity for inspiring enthusiasm and emulation quite as great as poetry unjoined to the divine enchantress, music. Plainly not drama, yet what is more dramatic than the novel? In the miracle of its pages you find theatre, scenery, actors, audience, and author. You may sit at your ease in your library chair and command the services of the most innumerable company of comedians, tragedians, lovers, ladies, buffoons, soubrettes, and pantomimists that the world ever knew. How many novels have been turned into dramas? How few dramas have been successfully expanded into novels? Thus the novel, while it is not history, nor poetry, nor the drama, is a combination of all, and it possesses more than this. Its lightness enables it to tell the history of the commonest peasant, a subject that history disdained until the novel bent to the task. Its flexibility makes it possible to write the history of types and classes. Its capacity enables it to convey science, to teach morals, to illuminate the abstract difficulties of every philosophy, to utter the despairing human protests stifled elsewhere, and to embrace every purpose for which words were created and human aspirations were kindled. That it has lent itself to base uses is true. How could it escape the contamination that has smirched every other art? And as in every other art, that which is base and false in fiction soon dies of its own inherent weakness and is forgotten. But decade by decade the novel grows more powerful, more noble, and more adaptable to the spiritual uses of man. The time will come when the novel will stand on the bookshelves with history, the philosophies, and the sciences, as of equal honor and use, necessary to complete the education of every scholar. Yet even then there will probably be a tribunal to pronounce it to be, if not a vice, at least of doubtful utility. End of On the Vice of Novel Reading by Young E. Allison.
Rules for Bathing by E. P. Miller, M.D., from the Scientific American, July 3, 1869. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rules for Bathing. 1. Baths should not be taken within at least 1 hour before eating, nor within 2 hours after, and not within 2 hours before, and 3 hours after is still better. The reason for this is that in bathing the blood is brought to the surface in large quantities and circulates freely in the capillaries of the skin, being drawn away from internal organs and generally diffused through the whole body, and the more freely this external circulation and warmth is kept up, the more refreshing and invigorating the bath becomes, and the greater the benefit derived from it. Whereas, when the stomach has recently been supplied with food, the blood is diverted from the external circulation to the digestive organs to supply the secretions and juices necessary to carry on the digestive process. From these facts it will be evident that if food be taken into the stomach too soon after a bath, the blood is directed to the stomach before a full reaction has taken place, thus interfering with its beneficial effects; while, on the other hand, if the bath be taken too soon after a meal, the blood is diverted from the digestive organs before digestion is completed, and thus a very important function of the body is interfered with. In cases of active congestion or inflammation, In fevers or in severe pain and distress, it may be necessary to make water applications irrespective of this rule. 2. The head and face should be thoroughly bathed at the commencement of every bath. This will prevent the rushing of blood to the head and ward off unpleasant sensations. 3. A bath should never be taken when the body is exhausted or too greatly fatigued by exercise, as a person in such a condition would not be likely to secure the proper reaction and warmth. Moderate exercise before a bath is usually beneficial, as it accelerates the circulation and secures a comfortable degree of warmth, which is always desirable before taking a bath. There is no danger from taking a general bath while in a perspiration, providing no fatigue accompanies it. For the sits and foot baths, however, it is better that the body be warm, but not perspiring. 4. All general baths should be taken briskly, and the bather himself, if able, should rub vigorously that he may quicken his circulation and respiration, and thus secure the warmth and glowing reaction that is so essential after every bath. This should be observed not only while in the bath, but in rubbing dry after it. 5. For drying the body after a general bath, a strong linen or cotton sheet is much better than towels. This should be for an adult at least 2 yards square, so as to envelop the whole body like a cloak, and with it he should be rubbed or rub himself till thoroughly dry. By using the sheet for wiping, the body is protected from the air, the escape of heat is prevented, and there is much less liability to feel chilly afterwards. Towels will suffice, however, for all local applications. 6. At the completion of the bath, the bather should immediately dress, and, if able, exercise in the open air or engage in some active employment. If not able to exercise, it is well to cover up warm in bed for an hour or so and sleep if possible. 7. Very nervous persons, or those whose digestion is much impaired, or circulation is imperfect and feeble, or temperature is below the normal standard, should be careful not to use cold water to any great extent in bathing. It may have a temporary beneficial effect, but in the end their sufferings will be likely to be increased. 8. Feeble invalids, consumptives, persons subject to hemorrhage of the lungs or the stomach, those who have just passed the crisis in fevers or other acute diseases, those suffering from profuse discharges, such as suppurations, diarrhea, cholera, etc., and also females during the menstrual period, should avoid the use of cold water as well as the excessive use of it in any form. 9. Always use a thermometer to determine the temperature of baths for invalids. 10. An invalid should not bathe in a room with a temperature below 70 degrees, and for most persons 80 degrees or 85 degrees would be better, provided there is good ventilation. End of Rules for Bathing, by E. P. Miller, M.D. Read by Leanne Howlett.
The Works of Benjamin Franklin, Volume 1, Chapter 15. Self-Denial Not the Essence of Virtue, by Benjamin Franklin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Daniel Cranston. Self-denial, not the essence of virtue. It is commonly asserted that without self-denial, there is no virtue, and that the greater the self-denial, the greater the virtue. If it were said that he who cannot deny himself anything he inclines to, though he knows it will be to his hurt, has not the virtue of resolution or fortitude, it would be intelligent enough. But, as it stands, it seems obscure or erroneous. Let us consider some of the virtues singly. If a man has no inclination to wrong people in his dealings, if he feels no temptation to it, and therefore never does it, Can it be said that he is not a just man? If he is a just man, has he not the virtue of justice? If to a certain man idle diversions have nothing in them that is tempting, and therefore he never relaxes his application to business for their sake, is he not an industrious man? Or has he not the virtue of industry? I might, in like manner, instance in all the rest of the virtues. But to make the thing short, as it is certain that the more we strive against the temptation to any vice, and practice the contrary virtue, the weaker will that temptation be, and the stronger will be that habit, till at length the temptation has no force, or entirely vanishes. Does it follow from thence that in our endeavors to overcome vice, we grow continually less and less virtuous, till at length we have no virtue at all? If self-denial be the essence of virtue, then it follows that the man who is naturally temperate, just, etc., is not virtuous, but that in order to be virtuous, he must, in spite of his natural inclination, wrong his neighbors, and eat and drink, etc., to excess. But perhaps it may be said that by the word virtue in the above assertion is meant merit, and so it should stand thus: without self-denial there is no merit, and the greater the self-denial, the greater the merit. The self-denial here meant must be when our inclinations are towards vice, or else it would still be nonsense. By merit is understood desert, and when we say a man merits, we mean that he deserves praise or reward. We do not pretend to merit anything of God, for he is above our services, and the benefits he confers on us are the effects of his goodness and bounty. All our merit, then, is with regard to one another, and from one to another. Taking, then, the assertion as it last stands, if a man does me a service from a natural benevolent inclination, does he deserve less of me than another who does me the like kindness against his inclination? If I have two journeymen, one naturally industrious, the other idle, but both perform a day's work equally good, ought I to give the latter the most wages? Indeed, lazy workmen are commonly observed to be more extravagant in their demands than the industrious. For if they have not more for their work, they cannot live as well. But though it be true to a proverb that lazy folks take the most pains, does it follow that they deserve the most money? If you were to employ servants in affairs of trust, would you not bid more for one you knew was naturally honest than for one naturally roguish, but who has lately acted honestly? For currents whose natural channel is dammed up, till the new course is by time worn sufficiently deep and become natural, are apt to break their banks. If one servant is more valuable than another, has he not more merit than the other? And yet this is not on account of superior self-denial. Is a patriot not praiseworthy if public spirit is natural to him? Is a pacing horse less valuable for being a natural pacer? Nor, in my opinion, has any man less merit for having in general natural virtuous inclinations. The truth is that temperance, justice, charity, etc., are virtues, whether practiced with or against our inclinations. And the man who practices them merits our love and esteem. And self-denial is neither good nor bad, but as it is applied. He that denies a vicious inclination is virtuous in proportion to his resolution. But the most perfect virtue is above all temptation, such as the virtue of the saints in heaven. And he who does a foolish, indecent, or wicked thing, merely because it is contrary to his inclination, like some mad enthusiasts I have read of, who ran about naked, under the notion of taking up the cross, is not practicing the reasonable science of virtue, but is a lunatic. End of Self-Denial Not the Essence of Virtue by Benjamin Franklin.
A Short Defence of Villains from Essays in Miniature by Agnes Replier. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Corey Samuel. Amid the universal greyness that has settled mistily down upon English fiction, amid the delicate drab-coloured shadings and half-lights which require, we are told, so fine a skill in handling, the old-fashioned reader misses, now and then, the vivid colouring of his youth. He misses the slow unfolding of quite impossible plots, the thrilling incidents that were wont pleasantly to arouse his apprehension, and, most of all, two characters once deemed essential to every novel, the hero and the villain. The heroine is left us still, and her functions are far more complicated than in the simple days of yore, when little was required of her save to be beautiful as the stars. She faces now the most intricate problems of life, and she faces them with conscious self-importance, a dismal power of analysis, and a robust candour in discussing their equivocal aspects that would have sent her buried sister blushing to the wall. There was sometimes a lamentable lack of solid virtue in this fair dead sister, a pitiful human weakness that led to her undoing, but she never talked so glibly about sin. As for the hero, he owes his banishment to the riotous manner in which his masters handled him. Bulwer strained our endurance and our credulity to the utmost, Disraeli took a step further, and Lothair, the last of his race, perished amid the cruel laughter of mankind. But the villain! Remember what we owe to him in the past. Think how dear he has become to every rightly constituted mind. And now we are told, soberly and coldly, by the thin-blooded novelists of the day, that his absence is one of the crowning triumphs of modern genius, that we have all grown too discriminating to tolerate in fiction a character who we feel does not exist in life. Man, we are reminded, is complex, subtle, unfathomable, made up of good and evil so dexterously intermingled that no one element predominates coarsely over the rest. He is to be studied warily and with misgivings, not classified with brutal ease into the virtuous and bad. It is useless to explain to these analysts that the pleasure we take in meeting a character in a book does not always depend on our having known him in the family circle, or encountered him in our morning paper, though, judged even by this stringent law, the villain holds his own. Accept Balzac's rule, and exclude from fiction not only all which might not really happen, but all which has not really happened in truth, and we would still have studies enough in total depravity to darken all the novels in Christendom. What murder of romance was ever so wanton, so tragic, and so sombre as that which gave to the Edinburgh highway the name of Gabriel's Road? There, in the sweet summer afternoon, fresh with the breath of primroses and cowslips, the young tutor cut the throats of his two little pupils in a mad, inexplicable revenge for their childish tale-bearing. Taken red-handed in the deed, he met with swift retribution from the furious populace, and the same hour which witnessed the crime saw his pinioned corpse dangling from the nearest tree, with the bloody knife hung in awful mockery around its neck. Thus the murder, and its punishment, conspired to make the lonely road a haunted path, ghost-ridden, terrible, where women shivered and hurried on, and little boys, creepy with fear, scampered by, breathless in the dusk, seeing before them always, on the ragged turf, two small, piteous, blood-smeared bodies, and hearing ever, overhead, the rattle of the rusty knife against the felon's bones. The highway, with its unholy associations discreetly perpetuated in its name, became an education to the good people of Edinburgh, and taught them the value of emotions. They must have indistinctly felt what Mr. Louis Stevenson has so well described, the subtle harmony that unites an evil deed to its location. Some places, he says, speak distinctly, certain dark gardens cry aloud for a murder, certain old houses demand to be haunted, certain coasts are set apart for shipwreck. Other spots again seem to abide their destiny, suggestive and impenetrable. And is all this fine and delicate sentiment, all this skilful playing with horror and fear, to be lost to fiction merely because, as De Quincey reluctantly admits, the majority of murderers are incorrect characters? May we not forgive their general incorrectness for the sake of their literary and artistic value? Shall Charles Lamb's testimony count for nothing when we remember his comfortable allusion to kind, light-hearted Wainwright? And what shall we think of Edward Fitzgerald, the gentlest and least hurtful of Englishmen, abandoning himself in the clear and genial weather to the delights of Tacitus, full of pleasant atrocity? Repentant villains, I must confess, are not greatly to my mind. They sacrifice their artistic to their ethical value, and must be handled with consummate skill to escape a suspicious flavour of Sunday school romance. The hardened criminal, disarmed and converted by the innocent attractions of childhood, is a favourite device of poets and story-writers who cater to the sentiments of maternity, but it is wiser to lay no stress upon the permanency of such conversions. That swift and sudden yielding to a gentle emotion or a noble aspiration, which is one of the undying traits of humanity, attracts us often by the very force of its evanescence, by the limitations which prove its truth. But the slow, stern process of regeneration is not an emotional matter, and cannot be convincingly portrayed with a few facile touches in the last chapter of a novel. Thackeray knew better than this when he showed us Becky Sharp touched and softened by her good little sister-in-law, heartsick now and then of her own troublesome schemes, yet sinking inevitably lower and lower through the weight of overmastering instincts and desires. She can aspire intermittingly to a cleaner life, but she can never hope to reach it. The simple literature of the past is curiously rich in these pathetic, transient glimpses into fallen nature's brighter side. Where can we see depicted with more tenderness and truth the fitful relenting of man's brutality, after it has wrought the ruin it devised, than in the fine old ballad of Edomer Gordon? The young daughter of the House of Rhodes is lowered from the walls of the burning castle, and the cruel Gordon spears transfix her as she falls. she lies dead, in her budding girlhood, at the feet of her father's foe, and his heart is strangely stirred and troubled when he looks at her childish face. O bonny, bonny was her mouth, and cherry were her cheeks, and clear, clear was her yellow hair, whereon the red blood drips. Then wi' his spear he turned her o'er, ogin her face was wan. He said, You were the first that e'er I wished alive again. He turned her o'er and o'er again, ogin her skin was white. I might her spared that bonny face, to ha' been some man's delight. It is pleasant to know that the ruthless butcher was promptly pursued and slain for his crime, but it is finer still to realise that brief moment of bitterness and shame. I have sometimes thought that Rossetti's sister Helen would have gained in artistic beauty if, after those 3 days of awful watching were over, after the glowing fragment of wax had melted in the flames, and her lover's soul had passed her, sighing on the wind, there had come to the stricken girl a pang of supreme regret, an impulse of mad desire to undo the horror she had wrought. The conscience of a sinner, to use a striking phrase of Mr. Brownell's, is doubtless readjusted rather than repudiated altogether. And there is an absolute truthfulness in these sudden relapses into grace. For this reason, doubtless, I find Mr. Blackmore's villains, with all their fascination and power, a shade too heavily, or at least too monotonously, darkened. Parson Chowne is a veritable devil, and it is only his occasional humour, manifested grimly in deeds, not words, which enables us to bear the weight of his insupportable wickedness. The introduction of the naked savages as an outrage to village propriety, the summons to church, when he has a mind to fire the ricks of his parishioners, these are the life-giving touches which mellow down this overwrought figure, this black and scowling thunderbolt of humanity. Perhaps, also, Mr. Blackmore, in his laudable desire for picturesqueness, lays too much stress on the malignant aspect, the appropriate physical condition of his sinners. From Parson Chowne's wondrous, unfathomable face, which chills every heart with terror, to the red glare in Donovan Bulragg's eyes, there is always something exceptional about these worthies to indicate to all beholders what manner of men they are. One is reminded of Charles II protesting not unnaturally against the perpetual swarthiness of stage villains. We never see a rogue in a play but we clap on him a black periwig, complained the dark-skinned monarch, with a sense of personal grievance in this forced association between complexion and crime. It was the same subtle inspiration which prompted Kean to play Shylock in a red wig, that suggested to Wilkie Collins Count Frosco's admirable size. The passion for embroidered waistcoats and fruit tarts, the petted white mice, the sympathetic gift of pastry to the organ-grinder's monkey, all the little touches which go to build up this colossal, tender-hearted, remorseless, irresistible scoundrel, are of interest and value to the portrait, but his fat is as essential as his knavery. It is one of those master-strokes of genius which breaks away from all accepted traditions to build up a new type, perfect and unapproachable. We can no more imagine a thin Fosco than a melancholy Dick Swiveller or a light-hearted Ravenswood. Mr. Andrew Lang, who enjoys upon all occasions the courage of his convictions, has, in one of those pleasant papers, at the sign of the ship, given utterance to a sentiment so shockingly at variance with the prevalent theory of fiction, that the reader is divided between admiration for his boldness and a vague surprise that a man should speak such words and live. There is a cheerfulness, too, about Mr. Lang's heterodoxy, a smiling ignorance of his own transgression, that warms our hearts and weakens our upbraiding. The old simple scheme, he says, in which you had a real, unmitigated villain, a heroine as pure as snow or flame, and a crowd of good ordinary people, gave us more agreeable reading, and reading not, I think, more remote from truth, than is to be found in Dr. Ibsen's Ghosts, or in his Pillars of Society. Now, to support such a statement would be unscrupulous, to condemn it dispiriting. but I wonder if the real unmitigated villain is quite so simple a product as Mr. Lang appears to imagine. May not his absence from literature be owing as much to the limitations as to the disregard of modern realists? Is he, in truth, so easily drawn as to be unworthy of their subtle and discriminating pens? Is Sir Giles Overreach a mere child's toy in comparison with Consul Burnick? And is Brian de Bois Guilbert unworthy to rank with Johann Tennyson and Oswald Alving? A villain must be a thing of power, handled with delicacy and grace. He must be wicked enough to excite our aversion, strong enough to arouse our fear, human enough to awaken some transient gleam of sympathy. We must triumph in his downfall, yet not barbarously nor with contempt, and the close of his career must be in harmony with all its previous development. Mrs. Pennell has told us the story of some old Venetian witches, who were converted from their dark ways and taught the charms of peace and godliness. But who would desire or credit the conversion of a witch? The potency of evil lies within her to the end, and, when by a few muttered words she can raise a hell-storm on the ocean, when her eyes' dim fire can wither the strength of her enemy, or when, with a lock of hair and a bit of wax, she can consume him with torturing pain, who will welcome her neighbourly advances? The proper and artistic end of a witch is at the stake, blue flames curling up to heaven and a handful of grey ashes scattered to the wind. Or, by the working of a stronger spell, she may be stiffened into stone and doomed to stand for ever on some desolate moor, where, underneath starless skies, her evil feet have strayed. Or perhaps that huge black cat, her sinister attendant, has completed his 9th year of servitude to 9 successive witches, and, by virtue of the power granted him at their expiration, he may whisk her off bodily on St. John's Eve to offer her a living holocaust to Satan. These are possibilities in strict sympathy with her character and history, if not with her inclinations. The last is in especial accordance with sound Italian tradition, and all reveal what Heine calls the melancholy pleasurable awe, the dark sweet horror of medieval ghost fancies. But a converted witch, walking demurely to vesper service, gossiping with good garrulous old women on the doorstep, or holding an innocent child within her withered arms, the very thought repels us instinctively and fires us with a sharp mistrust. Have a care, you foolish young mother, and snatch your baby to your breast, for even now he waxes paler and paler, as those cold, malignant heart-throbs chill his breath and wear his little life away. The final disposition of a mere earthly villain should likewise be a matter of artistic necessity, not a harsh trampling of arrogant virtue upon prostrate vice. There is no mistake so fatal as that of injustice to the evil element of a novel or a play. We all know how, when Portia pushes her triumphant casuistry a step too far, our sympathies veer obstinately round to Shylock's side, and refuse to be readjusted before the curtain falls. Perhaps Shakespeare intended this, who knows, and threw in Gratiano's last years to madden, not the usurer, but the audience. Or perhaps in Elizabeth's day, as in King John's, people had not grown so finical about the feelings of a Jew, and it is only the chilly tolerance of our enlightened age which prevents our enjoying as we should the devout prejudices of our ancestors. But when, in a modern novel, guiltless of all this picturesque superstition, we see the sinner treated with a narrow, nagging sort of severity, our unregenerate nature rebels stoutly against such a manifest lack of balance. Not long ago I chanced to read a story which actually dared to have a villain for a hero, and I promised myself much pleasure from so original and venturesome a step. But how did the very popular authoress treat her own creation? In the first place, when rescued from a truly feminine haze of hints, and dark whispers, and unsubstantiated innuendos, the hapless man is proven guilty of but 3 offences. He takes opium, he ejects his tenants, and he tries, not very successfully, to mesmerize his wife. Now, opium eating is a vice, the punishment for which is borne by the offender, and which merits as much pity as contempt. Rack renting is an unpardonable, but not at all a thrilling misdemeanour. And, in these days of psychological research, there are many excellent men who would not shrink from making hypnotic experiments on their grandmothers. In consequence, however, of such feeble atrocities, the hero-villain is subjected to a species of outlawry at the hands of all the good people in the book. His virtuous cousin makes open and highly honourable love to his virtuous wife, who responds with hearty alacrity. His virtuous cousin's still more virtuous brother comes within an ace of murdering him in cold blood, through motives of the purest philanthropy. Finally, one of these virtuous young men lets loose on him his family ghost, deliberately unsealing the spectral abiding place, and, while the virtuous wife clings around the virtuous cousin's neck and forbids him tenderly to go to the rescue, the accommodating spirit, who seems to have no sort of loyalty to the connection, slays the villain at his own doorstep and leaves the coast free for a second marriage service. Practically, the device is an admirable one, because, when the ghost retires once more to his seclusion, nobody can well be convicted of manslaughter, and a great deal of scandal is saved. But artistically, there is something repellent in this open and shameless persecution, in 3 persons and a hobgoblin conspiring against one poor man. Our sentiment is diverted from its proper channel, our emotions are manifestly incorrect. How are you to get up the sympathies of the audience in a legitimate manner? Asks Mr. Vincent Crummles, if there isn't a little man contending against a big one, unless there's at least 5 to 1, and we haven't hands enough for that business in our company. What would the noble-hearted Mr. Crummles have thought of reversing this natural order of things, and declaring victory for the multitude? How would human nature, in the provinces, have supported so novel and hazardous an innovation? Why should human nature, out of the provinces, be assumed to have outgrown its simple, chivalrous instincts? A good, strong, designing, despicable villain, or even villainess, a fair start, a stout fight, an artistic overthrow, and triumphant virtue smiling modestly beneath her orange blossoms. Shall we ever be too old and world-worn to love these old and world-worn things? End of A Short Defence of Villains by Agnes Replier.
Some Reflections on the Loss of the Titanic by Joseph Conrad. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by James Christopher. It is with a certain bitterness that one must admit to oneself that the late SS Titanic had a good press. It is perhaps because I have no great practice of daily newspapers, I have never seen so many of them together lying about my room, that the white spaces and the big lettering of the headlines have an incongruously festive air to my eyes, a disagreeable effect of a feverish exploitation of a sensual godsend. And if ever a loss at sea fell under the definition, in the terms of a bill of lading, of act of God, this one does, in its magnitude, suddenness, and severity, and in the chastening influence it should have on the self-confidence of mankind. I say this with all the seriousness the occasion demands, though I have neither the competence nor the wish to take a theological view of this great misfortune, sending so many souls to their last account. It is but a natural reflection. Another one, flowing also from the phraseology of bills of lading. A bill of lading is a shipping document limiting in certain of its clauses the liability of the carrier, is that the king's enemies, of a more or less overt sort, are not altogether sorry that this fatal mishap should strike the prestige of the greatest merchant service of the world. I believe that not 1,000 miles from these shores certain public prints have betrayed in Gothic letters their satisfaction, to speak plainly, by rather ill-natured comments. In what light one is to look at the action of the American Senate is more difficult to say. From a certain point of view, the sight of the august senators of a great power rushing to New York and beginning to bully and badger the luckless Yancey, on the very quayside, so to speak, seems to furnish the Shakespearean touch of the comic to the real tragedy of the fatuous drowning of all these people to who the last moment put their trust in mere bigness, in the reckless affirmations of commercial men and mere technicians, and in the irresponsible paragraphs of the newspapers booming these ships. Yes, a grim touch of comedy. One asks oneself what these men are after with this very provincial display of authority. I beg my friends in the United States pardon for calling these zealous senators men. I don't wish to be disrespectful. They may be of the stature of demigods for all I know. But at that great distance from the shores of effete Europe, and in the presence of so many guileless dead, their size seems diminished from this side. What are they after? What is there for them to find out? We know what had happened. The ship scraped her side against a piece of ice, and sank after floating for 2 hours and a half, taking a lot of people down with her. What more can they find from the unfair badgering of the unhappy Yamsey, or the ruffianly abuse of the same? Yamsey, I should explain, is a mere code address, and I use it here symbolically. I have seen commerce pretty close. I know what it is worth, and I have no particular regard for commercial magnates. But one must protest against these bumble-like proceedings. Is it indignation at the loss of so many lives which is at work here? Well, the American railroads kill very many people during one single year, I dare say. Then why don't these dignitaries come down on the presidents of their own railroads, of which one can't say whether they are mere means of transportation or a sort of gambling game for the use of American plutocrats? Is it only an ardent and upon the whole praiseworthy desire for information? But the reports of the inquiry tell us that the august senators, though raising a lot of questions testifying to the complete innocence and even blankness of their minds, are unable to understand what the second officer is saying to them. We are so informed by the press from the other side. Even such a simple expression as that one of the lookout men was stationed in the eyes of the ship was too much for the senators of the land of graphic expression. What it must have been in the more recondite manners I won't even try to think, because I have no mind for smiles just now. They were greatly exercised about the sound of explosions heard when half the ship was under water already. Was there one? Were there two? They seemed to be smelling a rat there. Has not some charitable soul told them, what even schoolboys who read sea stories know, that when a ship sinks from a leak like this, a deck or two is always blown up, and that when a steamship goes down by the head, the boilers may, and often do, break adrift with the sound which resembles the sound of an explosion. And they may indeed explode, for all I know. In the only case I have seen of a steamship sinking, there was such a sound, but I didn't dive down after her to investigate. She was not of 45,000 tons and declared unsinkable, but the sight was impressive enough. I shall never forget the muffled, mysterious detonation, the sudden agitation of the sea round the slowly raised stern, and to this day I have in my eye the propeller, seen perfectly in its frame against a clear evening sky. But perhaps the second officer has explained them by this time, this and a few other little facts. Though why an officer of the British merchant service should answer the questions of any king, emperor, autocrat, or senator of any foreign power, as to an event in which a British ship alone was concerned, and which did not even take place in the territorial waters of that power, passes my understanding. The only authority he is bound to answer is the Board of Trade. But with what face the Board of Trade, which, having made the regulations for 10,000-ton ships, put its dear old bald head under its wing for 10 years, took it out only to shelve an important report, and, with a dreary murmur, unsinkable, put it back again, in the hope of not being disturbed for another 10 years, with what face it will be putting questions to that man who has done his duty, as to the facts of this disaster, and as to his professional conduct in it. Well, I don't know. I have the greatest respect for our established authorities. I am a disciplined man, and I have a natural indulgence for the weaknesses of human institutions. But I will own that at times I have regretted their, how shall I say it, their imponderability. A Board of Trade, what is it? A board of... I believe the Speaker of the Irish Parliament is one of the members of it. A ghost. Less than that, as yet a mere memory. An office with adequate and no doubt comfortable furniture, and a lot of perfectly irresponsible gentlemen who exist packed in its equitable atmosphere softly, as if in a lot of cotton wool, and with no care in the world, for there can be no care without personal responsibility, such, for instance, as the seamen have, those seamen from whose mouths this irresponsible institution can take away the bread as a disciplinary measure. Yes, it's all that. And what more? The name of a politician, a party man. Less than nothing, a mere void without as much as a shadow of responsibility cast into it from that light in which move the masses of men who work, who deal with things and face the realities, not the words, of this life. Years ago I remember overhearing two genuine shellbacks of the old type commenting on a ship's officer, who, if not exactly incompetent, did not commend himself to their severe judgment of an accomplished sailorman. Said one, resuming and concluding the discussion in a funnily judicial tone, "The Board of Trade must have been drunk when they gave him his certificate." I confess that this notion of the Board of Trade as an entity having a brain which could be overcome by the fumes of strong liquor charmed me exceedingly, for then it would have been unlike the limited companies of which some exasperated wit has once said that they had no souls to be saved and no bodies to be kicked, and thus were free in this world and the next from all the effective sanctions of conscientious conduct. But, unfortunately, the picturesque pronouncement overheard by me was only a characteristic sally of an annoyed sailor. The Board of Trade is composed of bloodless departments. It has no limbs and no physiognomy, or else at the forthcoming inquiry it might have paid to the victims of the Titanic disaster the small tribute of a blush. I ask myself whether the Marine Department of the Board of Trade did really believe, when they decided to shelve the report on equipment for a time, that a ship of 45,000 tons, that any ship, could be made practically indestructible by means of watertight bulkheads. It seems incredible to anybody who had ever reflected upon the properties of material, such as wood or steel. You can't, let builders say what they like, make a ship of such dimensions as strong proportionally as a much smaller one. The shocks our old whalers had to stand amongst the heavy floes in Baffin's Bay were perfectly staggering, notwithstanding the most skilful handling, and yet they lasted for years. The Titanic, if one may believe the last reports, has only scraped against a piece of ice which, I suspect, was not an enormously bulky and comparatively easily seen berg, but the low edge of a floe, and sank. Leisurely enough, God knows. And here the advantage of bulkhead comes in, for time is a great friend, a good helper, though in this lamentable case these bulkheads served only to prolong the agony of the passengers who could not be saved. But she sank, causing, apart from the sorrow and the pity of the loss of so many lives, a sort of surprised consternation that such a thing could have happened at all. Why? You build a 45,000 tons hotel of thin steel plates to secure the patronage of, say, a couple of thousand rich people, for if it had been the immigrant trade alone, there would have been no such exaggeration of mere size. You decorate it in the style of the Pharaohs, or in the Louis Quinze style, I don't know which, and to please the aforesaid fatuous handful of individuals, who have more money than they know what to do with, and to the applause of 2 continents, you launch that mass with 2,000 people on board at 21 knots across the sea. A perfect exhibition of the modern blind trust in mere material and appliances. And then this happens. General uproar. The blind trust in material and appliances has received a terrible shock. I will say nothing of the credulity which accepts any statements which specialists, technicians, and office people are pleased to make, whether for the purposes of gain or glory. You stand there astonished and hurt in your profoundest sensibilities. But what else under the circumstances could you expect? For my part, I could much sooner believe an unsinkable ship of 3,000 tons than in one of 40,000 tons. It is one of those things that stand to reason. You can't increase the thickness of scantling and plates indefinitely, and the mere weight of this bigness is an added disadvantage. In reading the reports, the first reflection which occurs to one is that, if that luckless ship had been a couple of 100 feet shorter, she would have probably gone clear of the danger. But then, perhaps, she could not have had a swimming bath in a French café. That, of course, is a serious consideration. I am well aware that those responsible for her short and fatal existence ask us in desolate accents to believe that if she had hit end on she would have survived, which by a sort of coy implication seems to mean that it was all the fault of the officer of the watch (he is dead now) for trying to avoid the obstacle. We shall have presently, in deference to commercial and industrial interest, a new kind of seamanship, a very new and progressive kind. If you see anything in the way, by no means try to avoid it. Smash at it in full tilt, and then only, you shall see the triumph of material, of clever contrivances, of the whole box of engineering tricks, in fact, and cover with glory the commercial concern of the most unmitigated sort, a general trust, and a great shipbuilding yard, justly famed for the super excellence of its material and workmanship. Unsinkable. See? I told you she was unsinkable. If only handled in accordance with the new seamanship. Everything's in that. And doubtless the Board of Trade, if properly approached, would consent to give the needed instructions to its examiners of masters and mates. Behold the examination room of the future. Enter to the grizzled examiner a young man of modest aspect. Are you well up in the modern seamanship? I hope so, sir. Let's see. You are at night on the bridge in charge of a 150,000-ton ship, with a motor track, organ loft, etc., etc., with a full cargo of passengers, a full crew of 1,500 cafe waiters, 2 sailors, and a boy, 3 collapsible boats as per Board of Trade regulations, and going at your 3/4 speed of, say, about 40 knots. You perceive, suddenly right ahead, and close to, something that looks like a large ice floe. What would you do? Put the helm amidships. Very well. Why? In order to head head on. On what ground should you endeavor to head head on? Because we are taught by our builders and masters that the heavier the smash, the smaller the damage, and because of the requirements of material should be attended to. And so on, and so on. The new seamanship, when in doubt, try to ram fairly whatever's before you. Very simple. If only the Titanic had rammed that piece of ice, which was not a monstrous berg, fairly, every puffing paragraph would have been vindicated in the eyes of the credulous public which pays. But would it have been? Well, I doubt it. I am well aware that in the 80s the steamship Arizona, one of the greyhounds of the ocean in the jargon of that day, did run bows on against a very unmistakable iceberg, and managed to get into port on her collision bulkhead. But the Arizona was not, if I remember rightly, 5,000 tons register, let alone 45,000, and she was not going at 20 knots per hour. I can't be perfectly certain at this distance of time, but her sea speed could not have been more than 14 at the outside. Both these facts made for safety, and even if she had been engined to go 20 knots, there would not have been behind that speed the enormous mass, so difficult to check in its impetus, the terrific weight of which is bound to do damage to itself or others at the slightest contact. I assure you it is not for the vain pleasure of talking about my own poor experiences, but only to illustrate my point that I will relate here a very unsensational little incident I witnessed now rather more than 20 years ago in Sydney, New South Wales. Ships were beginning then to grow bigger year after year, though of course the present dimensions were not even dreamt of. I was standing on the circular quay with a Sydney pilot watching a big mail steamship of one of our best-known companies being brought alongside. We admired her lines, her noble appearance, and were impressed by her size as well, though her length, I imagine, was hardly less than half that of the Titanic. She came into the cove, as that part of the harbour is called, of course very slowly, and at some 100 feet or so short of the quay she lost her way. That quay was then a wooden one, a fine structure of mighty piles and stringers bearing a roadway, a thing of great strength. The ship, as I have said before, stopped moving when some 100 feet from it. Then her engines were rung on slow ahead, and immediately rung off again. The propeller made just about 5 turns, I should say. She began to move, stealing on, so to speak, without a ripple, coming alongside with the utmost gentleness. I went on looking her over, very much interested, but the man with me, the pilot, muttered under his breath, "Too much, too much." His exercised judgment had warned him of what I did not even suspect. But I believe that neither of us was exactly prepared for what happened. There was a faint concussion of the ground under our feet, a groaning of piles, a snapping of great iron bolts, and with the sound of ripping and splintering, as when a tree is blown down by the wind, a great strong piece of wood, a balk of square timber, was displaced several feet as if by enchantment. I looked at my companion in amazement. I could not have believed it, I declared. "No," he said, "you would not have thought that she would have cracked an egg, eh?" "I certainly wouldn't have thought that." He shook his head and added, "Aye, these great big things, they want some handling." Some months afterwards I was back in Sydney. The same pilot brought me in from the sea, and I found the same steamship, or else another as like her as 2 peas, lying at anchor not far from us. The pilot told me she had arrived the day before, and that he was to take her alongside tomorrow. I reminded him jocularly of the damage to the quay. "Oh," he said, "we are not allowed now to bring them in under their own steam. We are using tugs." A very wise regulation, and this is my point, that size is to a certain extent an element of weakness. The bigger the ship, the more delicately she must be handled. Here is a contact which, in the pilot's own words, you wouldn't think could have cracked an egg, with the astonishing result of something like 80 feet of good strong wooden quay shaken loose, iron bolts snapped, a balk of stout timber splintered. Now suppose that quay had been of granite, as surely it is now, or instead of the quay, if there had been, say, a North Atlantic fog there, with a full-grown iceberg in it awaiting the gentle contact of a ship groping its way along blindfold. Something would have been hurt, but it would not have been the iceberg. Apparently there is a point in development when it ceases to be true progress, in trades, in games, in the marvelous handiwork of men, and even in their demands and desires and aspirations of the moral and mental kind. There is a point when progress, to remain a real advance, must change slightly the direction of its line. But this is a wide question. What I wanted to point out here is that the old Arizona, the marvel of her day, was proportionally stronger, handier, better equipped than this triumph of modern naval architecture, the loss of which, in common parlance, will remain the sensation of this year. The clatter of the presses has been worthy of the tonnage, of the preliminary paeans of triumph round that vanished hull, of the reckless statements and elaborate descriptions of its ornate splendor. A great babble of news, and what sort of news too, good heavens! An eager comment has arisen around this catastrophe, though it seems to me that less a strident note would have been more becoming in the presence of so many victims left struggling on the sea, of lives miserably thrown away for nothing, or worse than nothing, for false standards of achievement, to satisfy a vulgar demand of a few money people for a banal hotel luxury, the only one they can understand, and because the big ship pays, in one way or another, in money or in advertising value. It is in more ways than one a very ugly business, and the mere scrape along the ship's side, so slight that, if the reports are to be believed, it did not interrupt a card party in the gorgeously fitted, but in chaste style, smoking room, or was it the delightful French cafe, is enough to bring on the exposure. All the people on board existed under a sense of false security. How false, it has been sufficiently demonstrated, and the fact which seems undoubted, that some of them actually were reluctant to enter the boats when told to do so, shows the strength of that falsehood. Incidentally, it also shows the sort of discipline on board these ships, the sort of hold kept on the passengers in the face of the unforgiving sea. These people seem to imagine it in an optional manner, whereas the order to leave the ship should be an order of the sternest character, to be obeyed unquestioningly and promptly by everyone on board, with men to enforce it at once, and to carry it out methodically and swiftly. And it is no use to say that it cannot be done, for it can. It has been done. The only requisite is manageableness of the ship herself, and of the number she carries on board. That is the great thing which makes for safety. A commander should be able to hold his ship and everything on board of her in the hollow of his hand, as it were. But with the modern foolish trust in material, and with those floating hotels, this has become impossible. A man may do his best, but he cannot succeed in a task which from greed, or more likely from sheer stupidity, has been made too great for anybody's strength. The readers of the English Review, who cast a friendly eye nearly 6 years ago on my reminiscences, and know how much the merchant service, ships and men has been to me, will understand my indignation that these men of whom, speaking in no sentimental phrase, but in the very truth of feeling, I can't even now think otherwise than as brothers, have been put by their commercial employers in the impossibility to perform efficiently their plain duty, and this from motives which I shall not enumerate here, but whose intrinsic unworthiness is plainly revealed by the greatness, the miserable greatness, of that disaster. Some of them have perished. To die for commerce is hard enough, but to go under that sea we have been trained to combat, with a sense of failure in the supreme duty of one's calling, is indeed a bitter fate. Thus they are gone, and the responsibility remains with the living, who will have no difficulty in replacing them by others just as good, at the same wages. It was their bitter fate. But I, who can look at some arduous years when their duty was my duty too, and their feelings were my feelings, can remember some of us who once upon a time were more fortunate. It is of them that I would talk a little, for my own comfort partly, and also because I am sticking all the time to my subject to illustrate my point, the point of manageableness which I have raised just now. Since the memory of the lucky Arizona has been evoked by others than myself, and made use of me for my own purpose, let me call up the ghost of another ship of that distant day, whose less lucky destiny inculcates another lesson making for my argument. The Douro, a ship belonging to the Royal Mail Steam Packet Company, was rather less than 1/10 the measurement of the Titanic. Yet, strange as it may appear to the ineffable hotel exquisites who formed the bulk of the first-class cross-Atlantic passengers, people of position and wealth and refinement did not consider it an intolerable hardship to travel in her, even all the way from South America, this being the service she was engaged upon. Of her speed I know nothing, but it must have been the average of the period, and the decorations of her saloons were, I dare say, quite up to the mark. But I doubt if her berth had been boastfully paragraphed all round the press, because that was not the fashion of the time. She was not a mass of material gorgeously furnished and upholstered. She was a ship, and she was not, in the apt words of an article by Commander C. Crunchley, R.N.R., which I have just read, run by a sort of hotel syndicate composed of the chief engineer, the purser, and the captain, as these monstrous Atlantic ferries are. She was really commanded, manned, and equipped as a ship meant to keep the sea, a ship first and last in the fullest meaning of the term, as the fact I am going to relate will show. She was off the Spanish coast, homeward bound, and fairly full just like the Titanic. And further, the proportion of her crew to her passengers, I remember quite well, was very much the same. The exact number of souls on board I have forgotten. It might have been nearly 300, certainly not more. The night was moonlit but hazy, the weather fine, with a heavy swell running from the westward, which means that she must have been rolling a great deal, and in that respect the conditions for her were worse than in the case of the Titanic. Sometime, either just before or just after midnight, to the best of my recollection, she was run into amidships and at right angles by a large steamer, after which backed out, and, herself apparently damaged, remained motionless at some distance. My recollection is that the door remained afloat after the collision for 15 minutes or thereabouts. It might have been 20, but certainly something under a half hour. In that time the boats were lowered, all the passengers put into them, and the lot shoved off. There was no time to do anything more. All the crew of the Dora went down with her, literally without a murmur. When she went, she plunged bodily down like a stone. The only members of the ship's company who survived were the third officer, who was from the first ordered to take charge of the boats, and the seamen told off to man them, 2 in each. Nobody else was picked up. A quartermaster, one of the saved in the way of duty, with whom I talked a month or so afterwards, told me that they pulled up to the spot, but could neither see a head nor hear the faintest cry. But I have forgotten. A passenger was drowned. She was a lady's maid who, frenzied with terror, refused to leave the ship. One of the boats waited near by till the chief officer, finding himself absolutely unable to tear the girl away from the rail to which she clung with a frantic grasp, ordered the boat away out of danger. My quartermaster told me that he spoke over to them in his ordinary voice, and this was the last sound heard before the ship sank. The rest is silence. I dare say there was the usual official inquiry, but who cared for it? That sort of thing speaks for itself with no uncertain voice, though the papers, I remember, gave the event no space to speak of, no large headlines, no headlines at all. You see, it was not the fashion at the time. A seaman-like piece of work, of which one cherishes the old memory at this juncture more than ever before. She was a ship commanded, manned, equipped, not a sort of marine Ritz, proclaimed unsinkable and sent adrift with its casual population upon the sea, without enough boats, without enough seamen, but with the Parisian cafe and 400 of poor devils of waiters, to meet the dangers, which, let the engineers say what they like, lurk always amongst the waves, sent with a blind trust in mere material, light-heartedly, to a most miserable, most fatuous disaster. There are, too, many ugly developments about this tragedy. The rush of the senatorial inquiry before the poor wretches escaped from the jaws of death had time to draw breath, the vituperative abuse of a man no more guilty than others in this matter, and the suspicion of this aimless fuss being a political move to get home on the M.T. Company, into which, in common parlance, the United States government has got its knife. I don't pretend to know why, though with the rest of the world I am aware of the fact. Perhaps there may be an excellent and worthy reason for it, but I venture to suggest that to take advantage of so many pitiful corpses is not pretty, and the exploiting of the mere sensation on the other side is not pretty in its wealth of heartless inventions. Neither is the welter of Marconi lies which has not been sent vibrating without some reason, for which it would be nauseous to inquire too closely, and the calamitous, baseless, gratuitous, circumstantial lie charging poor Captain Smith with desertion of his post by means of suicide is the vilest and most ugly thing of all this outburst of journalistic enterprise. Without feeling, without honor, without decency. But all this has its moral, and that other sinking which I have related here, into the memory of which a seaman turns with relief and thankfulness, has a moral too. Yes, material may fail, and men too may fail sometimes, but more often men, when they are given the chance, will prove themselves truer than steel, that wonderful thin steel from which the sides and the bulkheads of our modern sea leviathans are made. End of Some Reflections on the Loss of the Titanic